An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 11. From the Sandwich Islands to the Polar Circle. The Halbrane, singularly favoured by the weather, sighted the New South Orkneys group in 6 days after she had sailed from the Sandwich Islands. This archipelago was discovered by Palmer, an American, and Bothwell, an Englishman, jointly in 1821–22. Crossed by the 61st parallel, it is comprehended between the 44th and the 47th meridian. On approaching, we were able to observe contorted masses and steep cliffs on the north side, which became less rugged as they neared the coast, at whose edge lay enormous ice floes, heaped together in formidable confusion. These, before 2 months should have expired, should be drifted towards the temperate waters. At that season the whaling ships would appear to carry on the taking of the great blowing creatures, while some of their crews would remain on the island to capture seals and sea elephants. In order to avoid the strait, which was encumbered with islets and ice floes, Captain Len Guy first cast anchor at the south-eastern extremity of Laurie Island, where he passed the day on the 24th. Then, having rounded Cape Dundas, he sailed along the southern coast of Coronation Island, where the schooner anchored on the 25th. Our close and careful researches produced no result as regarded the sailors of the Jane. The islands and islets were peopled by multitudes of birds. Without taking the penguins into account, those guano-covered rocks were crowded with white pigeons, a species of which I had already seen some specimens. These birds have rather short, conical beaks, and red-rimmed eyelids. They can be knocked over with little difficulty. As for the vegetable kingdom in the New South Orkneys, it is represented only by grey lichen and some scanty seaweeds. Mussels are found in great abundance along the rocks. Of these we procured an ample supply. The boatswain and his men did not lose the opportunity of killing several dozens of penguins with their sticks, not from a ruthless instinct of destruction, but from the legitimate desire to procure fresh food.
"Their flesh is just as good as chicken, Mr. Jeorling," said Hurliguerly. "Did you not eat penguin at the Kerguelens?"
"Yes, boatswain, but it was cooked by Arkins."
"Very well, then, it will be cooked by Endicott here, and you will not know the difference."
And in fact we in the saloon, like the men in the forecastle, were regaled with penguin, and acknowledged the merits of our excellent sea cook. The Halbrane sailed on the 26th of November at 6 o'clock in the morning, heading south. She reascended the 43rd meridian. This we were able to ascertain very exactly by a good observation. This route it was that Weddell and then William Guy had followed, and, provided the schooner did not deflect either to the east or the west, she must inevitably come to Tsalal Island. The difficulties of navigation had to be taken into account, of course. The wind, continuing to blow steadily from the west, was in our favour, and if the present speed of the Halbrane could be maintained, as I ventured to suggest to Captain Len Guy, the voyage from the South Orkneys to the Polar Circle would be a short one. Beyond, as I knew, we should have to force the gate of the thick barrier of icebergs, or to discover a breach in that ice fortress. "So that in less than a month, captain," I suggested tentatively.
"In less than a month I hope to have found the iceless sea which Weddell and Arthur Pym described so fully, beyond the ice wall, and thenceforth we need only sail under ordinary conditions to Bennet Island in the first place, and afterwards to Tsalal Island. Once on that wide open sea, what obstacle could arrest or even retard our progress?"
"I can foresee none, captain, so soon as we shall get to the back of the ice wall. The passage through is the difficult point. It must be our chief source of anxieties, and if only the wind holds—" "It will hold, Mr. Jeorling.
all the navigators of the austral seas have been able to ascertain, as I myself have done, the permanence of this wind." "That is true, and I rejoice in the assurance, captain. Besides, I acknowledge, without shrinking from the admission, that I am beginning to be superstitious." "And why not, Mr. Jeorling? What is there unreasonable in admitting the intervention of a supernatural power in the most ordinary circumstances of life? And we who sail the Halbrane, should we venture to doubt it? Recall to your mind our meeting with the unfortunate Patterson on our ship's course, the fragment of ice carried into the waters where we were, and dissolved immediately afterwards. Were not these facts providential? Nay, I go further still, and am sure that, after having done so much to guide us towards our compatriots, God will not abandon us." "I think as you think, captain. No, his intervention is not to be denied, and I do not believe that chance plays the part assigned to it by superficial minds upon the stage of human life. All the facts are united by a mysterious chain." "A chain, Mr. Jeorling, whose first link, so far as we are concerned, is Patterson's ice block, and whose last will be Tsalal Island. Ah, my brother, my poor brother, left there for 11 years with his companions in misery, without being able to entertain the hope that succour ever could reach them, and Patterson carried far away from them under we know not what conditions, they not knowing what had become of him. If my heart is sick when I think of these catastrophes, Mr. Jeorling, at least it will not fail me, unless it be at the moment when my brother throws himself into my arms." So then we too were agreed in our trust in Providence. It had been made plain to us in a manifest fashion that God had entrusted us with a mission, and we would do all that might be humanly possible to accomplish it. The schooner's crew, I ought to mention, were animated by like sentiments, and shared the same hopes. I alluded to the original seamen, who were so devoted to their captain. As for the new ones, they were probably indifferent to the result of the enterprise, provided it should secure the profits promised to them by their engagement. At least I was assured by the boatswain that such was the case, but with the exception of Hunt. This man had apparently not been induced to take service by the bribe of high wages or prize money. He was absolutely silent on that and every other subject. "If he does not speak to you, boatswain," I said, "neither does he speak to me." "Do you know, Mr. Jeorling, what it is my notion that man has already done?" "Tell me, Hurliguerly." "Well, then, I believe he has gone far, far into the southern seas. Let him be as dumb as a fish about it. Why he is dumb is his own affair. But if that sea hog of a man has not been inside the Antarctic Circle, and even the ice wall by a good dozen degrees, may the first sea we ship carry me overboard." "From what do you judge, boatswain?" "From his eyes, Mr. Jeorling, from his eyes. No matter at what moment, let the ship's head be as it may, those eyes of his are always on the south, open, unwinking, fixed like guns in position." Hurliguerly did not exaggerate, and I had already remarked this. To employ an expression of Edgar Poe's, Hunt had eyes like a falcon's. "When he is not on the watch," resumed the boatswain, "that savage leans all the time with his elbows on the side, as motionless as he is mute. His right place would be at the end of our bow, where he would do for a figurehead to the Halbrane, and a very ugly one at that. And then, when he is at the helm, Mr. Jeorling, just observe him. His enormous hands clutch the handles as though they were fastened to the wheel. He gazes at the binnacle as though the magnet of the compass were drawing his eyes. I pride myself on being a good steersman, but as for being the equal of Hunt, I'm not. With him, not for an instant does the needle vary from the sailing line, however rough a lurch she may give. I am sure that if the binnacle lamp were to go out in the night, Hunt would not require to relight it. The fire in his eyes would light up the dial and keep him right." For several days our navigation went on in unbroken monotony, without a single incident, and under favourable conditions. The spring season was advancing, and whales began to make their appearance in large numbers. In these waters a week would suffice for ships of heavy tonnage to fill their casks with the precious oil. Thus the new men of the crew, and especially the Americans, did not conceal their regret for the captain's indifference in the presence of so many animals worth their weight in gold, and more abundant than they had ever seen whales at that period of the year. The leading malcontent was Hearne, a sealing master, to whom his companions were ready to listen. He had found it easy to get the upper hand of the other sailors by his rough manner and the surly audacity that was expressed by his whole personality. Hearne was an American, and 45 years of age. He was an active, vigorous man, and I could see him, in my mind's eye, standing up in his double-bowed whaling boat, brandishing the harpoon, darting it into the flank of a whale, and paying out the rope. He must have been fine to see. Granted his passion for this business, I could not be surprised that his discontent showed itself upon occasion. In any case, however, our schooner was not fitted out for fishing, and the implements of whaling were not on board. One day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I had gone forward to watch the gambols of a school of the huge sea mammals. Hearne was pointing them out to his companions and muttering in disjointed phrases: "There, look! There's a fin back! There's another, and another, 3 of them with their dorsal fins 5 or 6 feet high! Just see them swimming between 2 waves, quietly, making no jumps. Ah, if I had a harpoon, I'd bet my head that I could send it into one of those 4 yellow spots they have on their bellies. But there's nothing to be done in this traffic box. One cannot stretch one's arms. Devil take it! In these seas it is fishing we ought to be at, not—" Then, stopping short, he swore a few oaths, and cried out, "And that other whale?" "The one with a hump like a dromedary?" asked a sailor. "Yes, it's a humpback," replied Hearne. "Do you make out its wrinkled belly, and also its long dorsal fin? They are not easy to take, those humpbacks, for they go down into the great depths and devour long reaches of your lines. Truly, we deserve that he should give us a switch of his tail on our side, since we don't send a harpoon into his." "Look out! Look out!" shouted the boatswain. This was not to warn us that we were in danger of receiving the formidable stroke of the humpback's tail which the sea master had wished us. No, an enormous blower had come alongside the schooner, and almost on the instant a spout of ill-smelling water was ejected from its blow-hole with a noise like a distant roar of artillery. The whole foredeck to the main hatch was inundated. "That's well done," growled Hearne, shrugging his shoulders, while his companions shook themselves and cursed the humpback. Besides these 2 kinds of cetacea, we had observed several right whales, and these are the most usually met with in the southern seas. They have no fins, and their blubber is very thick. The taking of these fat monsters of the deep is not attended with much danger. The right whales are vigorously pursued in the southern seas, where the little shell fish called whale's food abound. The whales subsist entirely upon these small crustaceans. Presently one of the right whales, measuring 60 feet in length, that is to say, the animal was the equivalent of 100 barrels of oil, was seen floating within 3 cable lengths of the schooner. "Yes, that's a right whale!" exclaimed Hearne. "You might tell it by its thick short spout. See, that one on the port side, like a column of smoke, that's the spout of a right whale. And all this is passing before our very noses, a dead loss! Why, it's like emptying money bags into the sea, not to fill one's barrels when one can. A nice sort of captain indeed, to let all this merchandise be lost, and do such wrong to his crew!" "Hearne," said an imperious voice, "go up to the maintop. You will be more at your ease there to reckon the whales." "But, sir—" "No reply, or I'll keep you up there till to morrow. Come, be off at once." And as he would have got the worst of an attempt at resistance, the sealing master obeyed in silence. The season must have been abnormally advanced, for although we continued to see a vast number of cetaceans, we did not catch sight of a single whaling ship in all this fishing ground. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 12. Between the Polar Circle and the Ice Wall. Since the Halbrane has passed beyond the imaginary curve drawn at 23½ from the Pole, it seems as though she had entered a new region, that region of desolation and silence, as Edgar Poe says, that magic person of splendour and glory in which the Eleanora's singers longed to be shut up to all eternity, that immense ocean of light ineffable. It is my belief, to return to less fanciful hypotheses, that the Antarctic region, with a superficies of more than 5,000,000 of square miles, has remained what our spheroid was during the glacial period. In the summer the southern zone, as we all know, enjoys perpetual day, owing to the rays projected by the orb of light above his horizon in his spiral ascent. Then, so soon as he has disappeared, the long night sets in, a night which is frequently illuminated by the polar aurora or northern lights. It was then in the season of light that our schooner was about to sail in these formidable regions. The permanent brightness would not fail us before we should have reached Tsalal Island, where we felt no doubt of finding the men of the Jane. When Captain Len Guy, West, and the old sailors of the crew learned that the schooner had cleared the 66th parallel of latitude, their rough and sunburnt faces shone with satisfaction. The next day Hurliguerly accosted me on the deck with a broad smile and a cheerful manner. "So, then, Mr. Jeorling," said he, "we've left the famous circle behind us." "Not far enough, boatswain, not far enough." "Ah, that will come, but I am disappointed." "In what way?" "Because we have not done what is usual on board ships on crossing the line." "You regret that?" "Certainly I do, and the Halbrane might have been allowed the ceremony of a southern baptism." "A baptism? And whom would you have baptized, boatswain, seeing that all our men, like yourself, have already sailed beyond this parallel?" "We? Oh yes, but you? Oh no, Mr. Jeorling. And why, may I ask, should not that ceremony be performed in your honour?" "True, boatswain,
This is the first time in the course of my travels that I have been in so high a latitude." "And you should have been rewarded by a baptism, Mr. Jeorling. Yes, indeed, but without any big fuss, no drum and trumpet about it, and leaving out old Father Neptune with his masquerade. If you would permit me to baptize you—" "So be it, Hurliguerly," said I, putting my hand into my pocket. "Baptize as you please. Here is something to drink my health with at the nearest tavern." "Then that will be Bennet Islet or Tsalal Island, provided there are any taverns in those savage islands, and any Atkinses to keep them." "Tell me, boatswain, I always get back to Hunt, does he seem so much pleased to have passed the Polar Circle as the Halbrane's old sailors are?" "Who knows? There's nothing to be got out of him one way or another. But, as I have said before, if he has not already made acquaintance with this ice barrier—" "What makes you think so?" "Everything and nothing, Mr. Jeorling. One feels these things, one doesn't think them. Hunt is an old sea dog, who has carried his canvas bag into every corner of the world." The boatswain's opinion was mine also, and some inexplicable presentiment made me observe Hunt constantly, for he occupied a large share of my thoughts. Early in December the wind showed a north west tendency, and that was not good for us, but we would have no serious right to complain so long as it did not blow due south west. In the latter case the schooner would have been thrown out of her course, or at least she would have had a struggle to keep in it, and it was better for us, in short, not to stray from the meridian which we had followed since our departure from the New South Orkneys. Captain Len Guy was made anxious by this alteration in the wind, and besides, the speed of the Halbrane was manifestly lessened, for the breeze began to soften on the 4th, and in the middle of the night it died away. The morning the sails hung motionless and shrivelled along the masts. Although not a breath reached us, and the surface of the ocean was unruffled, the schooner was rocked from side to side by the long oscillations of the swell coming from the west. "The sea feels something," said Captain Len Guy to me, "and there must be rough weather on that side," he added, pointing westward. "The horizon is misty," I replied, "but perhaps the sun towards noon—" "The sun has no strength in this latitude, Mr. Jeorling, not even in summer. Jem!" West came up to us. "What do you think of the sky?" "I do not think well of it. We must be ready for anything and everything, captain." "Has not the look out given a warning of the first drifting ice?" I asked. "Yes," replied Captain Len Guy, "and if we get near the icebergs, the damage will not be to them. Therefore, if prudence demands that we should go either to the east or to the west, we shall resign ourselves, but only in case of absolute necessity." The watch had made no mistake. In the afternoon we sighted masses, islets they might be called, of ice, drifting slowly southward, but these were not yet of considerable extent or altitude. These packs were easy to avoid; they could not interfere with the sailing of the Halbrane. But although the wind had hitherto permitted her to keep on course, she was not advancing, and it was exceedingly disagreeable to be rolling about in a rough and hollow sea which struck our ship's sides most unpleasantly. At about 2 o'clock it was blowing a hurricane from all the points of the compass. The schooner was terribly knocked about, and the boatswain had the deck cleared of everything that was movable by her rolling and pitching. Fortunately the cargo could not be displaced, the stowage having been effected with perfect forecast of nautical eventualities. We had not to dread the fate of the Grampus, which was lost owing to negligence in her lading. It will be remembered that the brig turned bottom upwards, and that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters remained for several days crouching on its keel. Besides, the schooner's pumps did not give a drop of water. The ship was perfectly sound in every part, owing to the efficient repairs that had been done during our stay at the Falklands. The temperature had fallen rapidly, and hail, rain, and snow thickened and darkened the air. At 10 o'clock in the evening I must use this word, although the sun remained always above the horizon the tempest increased, and the captain and his lieutenant, almost unable to hear each other's voices amid the elemental strife, communicated mostly by gestures, which is as good a mode of speech between sailors. I could not make up my mind to retire to my cabin, and, seeking the shelter of the round house, I remained on deck, observing the weather phenomenon, and the skill, certainty, celerity, and effect with which the crew carried out the orders of the captain and West. It was a strange and terrible experience for a landsman, even one who had seen so much of the sea and seamanship as I had. At the moment of a certain difficult manoeuvre, 4 men had to climb to the crossbars of the foremast in order to reef the mainsail. The first who sprang to the ratlines was Hunt. The second was Martin Holt. Burry and one of the recruits followed them. I could not have believed that any man could display such skill and agility as Hunt's. His hands and feet hardly caught the ratlines. Having reached the crossbars first, he stretched himself on the ropes to the end of the yard, while Holt went to the other end, and the 2 recruits remained in the middle. While the men were working, and the tempest was raging round us, a terrible lurch of the ship to starboard under the stroke of a mountainous wave flung everything on the deck into wild confusion, and the sea rushed in through the scupper holes. I was knocked down, and for some moments was unable to rise. So great had been the incline of the schooner that the end of the yard of the mainsail was plunged 3 or 4 feet into the crest of a wave. When it emerged, Martin Holt, who had been astride on it, had disappeared. A cry was heard, uttered by the sailing master, whose arm could be seen wildly waving amidst the whiteness of the foam. The sailors rushed to the side and flung out, one a rope, another a cask, a third a spar, in short any object of which Martin Holt might lay a hold. At the moment when I struggled up to my feet I caught sight of a massive substance which cleft the air and vanished in the whirl of the waves. Was this a second accident? No, it was a voluntary action, a deed of self-sacrifice. Having finished his task, Hunt had thrown himself into the sea that he might save Martin Holt. 2 men overboard! Yes, 2, one to save the other. And were they not about to perish together? The 2 heads rose to the foaming surface of the water. Hunt was swimming vigorously, cutting through the waves, and was nearing Martin Holt. "They are lost! Both lost!" exclaimed the captain. "The boat, West, the boat!" "If you give the order to lower it," answered West, "I will be the first to get into it, although at the risk of my life. But I must have the order." In unspeakable suspense the ship's crew and myself had witnessed this scene. None thought of the position of the Halbrane, which was sufficiently dangerous. All eyes were fixed upon the terrible waves. Now fresh cries, the frantic cheers of the crew, rose above the roar of the elements. Hunt had reached the drowning man just as he sank out of sight, had seized hold of him, and was supporting him with his left arm, while Holt, incapable of movement, swayed helplessly about like a weed. With the other arm, Hunt was swimming bravely and making way towards the schooner. A minute, which seemed endless, passed. The 2 men, the one dragging the other, were hardly to be distinguished in the midst of the surging waves. At last Hunt reached the schooner, and caught one of the lines hanging over the side. In a minute Hunt and Martin Holt were hoisted on board. The latter was laid down at the foot of the foremast, and the former was quite ready to go to his work. Holt was speedily restored by the aid of vigorous rubbing. His senses came back, and he opened his eyes. "Martin Holt," said Captain Len Guy, who was leaning over him, "you have been brought back from very far." "Yes, yes, captain," answered Holt, as he looked about him with a searching gaze. "But who saved me?"
"Hunt!" cried the boatswain. "Hunt risked his life for you."
As the latter was hanging back, Hurliguerly pushed him towards Martin Holt, whose eyes expressed the liveliest gratitude. "Hunt," he said, "you have saved me. But for you I should have been lost. I thank you." Hunt made no reply. "Hunt," resumed Captain Len Guy, "don't you hear?" The man seemed not to have heard. "Hunt," said Martin Holt again, "come near to me. I thank you. I want to shake hands with you." And he held out his right hand. Hunt stepped back a few paces, shaking his head with the air of a man who did not want so many compliments for a thing so simple, and quietly walked forward to join his shipmates, who were working vigorously under the orders of West. Decidedly this man was a hero in courage and self devotion, but equally decided he was a being impervious to impressions, and not on that day either was the boatswain destined to know the colour of his words. For 3 whole days, the 6th, 7th, and 8th of December, the tempest raged in these waters, accompanied by snowstorms which perceptibly lowered the temperature. It is needless to say that Captain Len Guy proved himself a true seaman, that James West had an eye to everything, that the crew seconded them loyally, and that Hunt was always foremost when there was work to be done or danger to be incurred. In truth, I do not know how to give an idea of this man. What a difference there was between him and most of the sailors recruited at the Falklands, and especially between him and Hearne, the sealing master. They obeyed, no doubt, for such a master as James West gets himself obeyed, whether with good or ill will. But behind backs what complaints were made, what recriminations were exchanged! All this, I feared, was of evil presage for the future. Martin Holt had been able to resume his duties very soon, and he fulfilled them with hearty good will. He knew the business of a sailor right well, and was the only man on board who could compete with Hunt in handiness and zeal. "Well, Holt," I said to him one day when he was talking with the boatswain, "what terms are you on with that queer fellow Hunt now? Since the salvage affair An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 13. Along the Front of the Icebergs. Although the seas beyond the Polar Circle were wildly tumultuous, it is but just to acknowledge that our navigation had been accomplished, so far, under exceptional conditions. And what good luck it would be if the Halbrane, in this first fortnight of December, were to find the Weddell route open! There I am talking of the Weddell route as though it were a macadamized road, well kept, with milestones, and "This way to the South Pole" on a sign post. The numerous wandering masses of ice gave our men no trouble. They were easily avoided. It seemed likely that no real difficulties would arise until the schooner should have to try to make a passage for herself through the icebergs. Besides, there was no surprise to be feared. The presence of ice was indicated by a yellowish tint in the atmosphere, which the whalers call blink. This is a phenomenon peculiar to the glacial zones, which never deceives the observer. For 5 successive days the Halbrane sailed without sustaining any damage, without having, even for a moment, had to fear a collision. It is true that in proportion as she advanced towards the south the number of ice packs increased, and the channels became narrower. On the 14th an observation gave us 72° 37' for latitude, our longitude remaining the same, between the 42nd and 43rd meridian. This was already a point beyond the Antarctic Circle that few navigators had been able to reach. We were at only 2 degrees lower than Weddell. The navigation of the schooner naturally became a more delicate matter in the midst of those dim, wan masses, soiled with the excreta of birds. Many of them had a leprous look. Compared with their already considerable volume, how small our little ship, over whose mast some of the icebergs already towered, must have appeared! Captain Len Guy admirably combined boldness and prudence in his command of the ship. He never passed to leeward of an iceberg if the distance did not guarantee the success of any manoeuvre whatsoever that might suddenly become necessary. He was familiar with all the contingencies of ice navigation, and was not afraid to venture into the midst of these flotillas of drifts and packs. That day he said to me, "Mr. Jeorling, this is not the first time that I have tried to penetrate into the Polar Sea, and without success. Well, if I made the attempt to do this when I had nothing but presumption as to the fate of the Jane to go upon, what shall I not do now that presumption is changed into certainty?" "I understand that, captain, and of course your experience of navigation in these waters must increase our chances of success." "Undoubtedly. Nevertheless, all that lies beyond the fixed icebergs is still unknown for me, as it is for other navigators." "The unknown? No, not absolutely, captain, since we possess the important reports of Weddell, and I must add, of Arthur Pym also." "Yes, I know. They have spoken of the open sea. Do you not believe that such a sea exists?" "Yes, I do believe it exists, and for valid reasons. In fact, it is perfectly manifest that these masses called icebergs and ice fields could not be formed in the ocean itself. It is the tremendous and irresistible action of the surge which detaches them from the continents or islands of the high latitudes. Then the currents carry them into less cold waters, where their edges are worn by the waves, while the temperature disintegrates their bases and their sides, which are subjected to thermometric influences." "That seems very plain," I replied. "Then these masses have come from the icebergs. They clash with them in drifting, sometimes break into the main body, and clear their passage through. Again, we must not judge the southern by the northern zone. The conditions are not identical. Cook has recorded that he never met the equivalent of the Antarctic ice mountains in the Greenland seas, even at a higher latitude." "What is the reason?" I asked. "No doubt that the influence of the south winds is predominant in the northern regions. Now those winds do not reach the northern regions until they have been heated in their passage over America, Asia, and Europe, and they continue to raise the temperature of the atmosphere. The nearest land, ending in the points of Cape of Good Hope, Patagonia, and Tasmania, does not modify the atmospheric currents." "That is an important observation, captain, and it justifies your opinion with regard to an open sea."
Yes, open, at least for 10 degrees behind the icebergs. Let us, then, only get through that obstacle, and our greatest difficulty will have been conquered. You are right in saying that the existence of that open sea has been formally recognized by Weddell." "And by Arthur Pym, captain." "And by Arthur Pym." From the 15th of December the difficulties of navigation increased with the number of the drifting masses. The wind, however, continued to be uniformly favourable, showing no tendency to veer to the south. The breeze freshened now and then, and we had to take in sail. When this occurred we saw the sea foaming along the sides of the ice packs, covering them with sprays like the rocks on the coast of a floating island, but without hindering their onward march. Our crew could not fail to be impressed by the sight of the schooner making her way through these moving masses, the new men among them at least, for the old hands had seen such manoeuvres before. But they soon became accustomed to it, and took it all for granted. It was necessary to organize the lookout ahead with the greatest care. West had a cask fixed at the head of the foremast, which is called a crow's nest, and from thence an unremitting watch was kept. The 16th was a day of excessive fatigue to the men. The packs and drifts were so close that only very narrow and winding passageway between them was to be found, so that the working of the ship was more than commonly laborious. Under these circumstances none of the men grumbled, but Hunt distinguished himself by his activity. Indeed, he was admitted by Captain Len Guy and the crew to be an incomparable seaman, but there was something mysterious about him that excited the curiosity of them all. At this date the Halbrane could not be very far from the icebergs. If she held on in her course in that direction she would certainly reach them before long, and would then have only to seek for a passage. Hitherto, however, the lookout had not been able to make out between the icebergs an unbroken crest of ice beyond the ice fields. Constant and minute precautions were indispensable all day on the 16th, for the helm, which was loosened by merciless blows and bumps, was in danger of being unshipped. The sea mammals had not forsaken these seas. Whales were seen in great numbers, and it was a fairy-like spectacle when several of them spouted simultaneously. With fin backs and hump backs, porpoises of colossal size appeared, and these Hearne harpooned cleverly when they came within range. The flesh of these creatures was much relished on board, and Endicott had cooked it in his best manner. As for the usual Antarctic birds, petrels, pigeons, and cormorants, they passed in screaming flocks, and legions of penguins ranged along the edges of the ice fields, watched the evolutions of the schooner. These penguins are the real inhabitants of these dismal solitudes, and nature could not have created a type more suited to the desolation of the glacial zone. On the morning of the 17th, the man in the crow's nest at last signalled the icebergs. 5 or 6 miles to the south a long dentated crest appeared itself, plainly standing out against the fairly clear skies, and all along it drifted thousands of ice packs. This motionless barrier stretched before us from the northwest to the southeast, and by merely sailing along it the schooner would still gain some degrees southwards. When the Halbrane was within 3 miles of the icebergs, she lay to in the middle of a wide basin which allowed her complete freedom of movement. A boat was lowered, and Captain Len Guy got into it, with the boatswain, 4 sailors at the oars, and 1 at the helm. The boat was pulled in the direction of the enormous rampart. Vain search was made for a channel through which the schooner could have slipped, and after 3 hours of this fatiguing reconnoitring, the men returned to the ship. Then came a squall of rain and snow, which caused the temperature to fall to 36 degrees. 2.22 degrees Celsius.
above zero, and shut out the view of the ice rampart from us. During the next 24 hours the schooner lay within 4 miles of the icebergs. To bring her nearer would have been to get among winding channels from which it might not have been possible to extricate her. Not that Captain Len Guy did not long to do this, in his fear of passing some opening unperceived.
"If I had a consort," he said, "I would sail closer along the icebergs, and it is a great advantage to be two, when one is on such an enterprise as this. But the Halbrane is alone, and if she were to fail us—"
Even though we approached no nearer to the icebergs than prudence permitted, our ship was exposed to great risk, and West was constantly obliged to change his trim in order to avoid the shock of an ice field. Fortunately the wind blew from east to nor'-nor'-east, without variation, and it did not freshen. Had a tempest arisen, I know not what would have become of the schooner. Yes, though I do know too well, she would have been lost and all on board of her. In such a case the Halbrane could not have escaped. We must have been flung on the base of the barrier. After a long examination, Captain Len Guy had to renounce the hope of finding a passage through the terrible wall of ice. It remained only to endeavour to reach the southeast point of it. At any rate, by following that course we lost nothing in latitude, and in fact, on the 18th the observation taken made the 73rd parallel the position of the Halbrane. I must repeat, however, that navigation in the Antarctic seas will probably never be accomplished under more felicitous circumstances. The precocity of the summer season, the permanence of the north wind, the temperature 49° at the lowest, all this was the best of good fortune. I need not add that we enjoyed perpetual light, and the whole 24 hours round the sun's rays reached us from every point of the horizon. 2 or 3 times the captain approached within 2 miles of the icebergs. It was impossible but that the vast masses must have been subjected to climatic influences. Ruptures must surely have taken place at some points. But his search had no result, and we had to fall back into the current from west to east. I must observe at this point that during all our search we never descried land or the appearance of land out at sea, as indicated on the charts of preceding navigators. These maps are incomplete, no doubt, but sufficiently exact in their main lines. I am aware that ships have often passed over the indicated bearings of land. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 14. A Voice in a Dream. Entirely free from ice? No, it would have been premature to affirm this as a fact. A few icebergs were visible in the distance, while some drifts and packs were still going east. Nevertheless, the break up had been very thorough on that side, and the sea was in reality open, since a ship could sail freely.
"God has come to our aid," said Captain Len Guy. "May he be pleased to guide us to the end."
"In a week," I remarked, "our schooner might come in sight of Tsalal Island."
"Provided that the east wind lasts, Mr. Jeorling. Don't forget that in sailing along the icebergs to their eastern extremity, the Halbrane went out of her course, and she must be brought back towards the west."
"The breeze is for us, captain."
"And we shall profit by it, for my intention is to make for Bennet Islet. It was there that my brother first landed, and so soon as we shall have sighted that island, we shall be certain that we are on the right route. To day, when I have ascertained our position exactly, we shall steer for Bennet Islet."
"Who knows but we may come upon some fresh sign?"
"It is not impossible, Mr. Jeorling."
I need not say that recourse was had to the surest guide within our reach, that veracious narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which I read and re read with intense attention, fascinated as I was by the idea that I might be permitted to behold with my own eyes those strange phenomena of nature in the Antarctic world, which I, in common with all Edgar Poe's readers, had hitherto regarded as creations of the most imaginative writer who ever gave voice by his pen to the fantasies of a unique brain. No doubt a great part of the wonders of Arthur Gordon Pym's narrative would prove pure fiction, but even if a little of the marvellous story were found to be true, how great a privilege would be mine! The picturesque and wonderful side of the story we were studying as gospel truth had little charm but the slightest interest for Captain Len Guy. He was indifferent to everything in Pym's narrative that did not relate directly to the castaways of Tsalal Island. His mind was solely and constantly set upon their rescue. According to the narrative of Arthur Pym, Jane experienced serious difficulties, due to bad weather, from the 1st to the 4th of January 1828. It was not until the morning of the 5th, in latitude 23 degrees 15 minutes, that she found a free passage through the last iceberg that barred her way. The final difference between our position and the Jane in a parallel ease was that the Jane took 15 days to accomplish the distance of 10 degrees, or 600 miles, which separated her on the 5th of January from Tsalal Island, while on the 19th of December the Halbrane was only about 7 degrees, or 400 miles, off the island. Bennet Islet, where Captain Guy intended to put in for 24 hours, was 50 miles nearer. Our voyage was progressing under prosperous conditions. We were no longer visited by sudden hail and snowstorms, or those rapid falls of temperature which tried the crew of the Jane so sorely. A few ice floes drifted by us, occasionally peopled as tourists throng a pleasure yacht by penguins, and also by dusky seals, lying flat upon the white surfaces like enormous leeches. Above this strange flotilla we traced the incessant flight of petrels, pigeons, black puffins, divers, grebe, sterns, cormorants, and the sooty black albatross of the high latitudes. Huge medusas, exquisitely tinted, floated on the water like spread parasols. Among the denizens of the deep, captured by the crew of the schooner with line and net, I noted more particularly a sort of giant John Dory (dorade), 3 feet in length, with firm and savoury flesh. During the night, or rather what ought to have been the night of the 19th to 20th, my sleep was disturbed by a strange dream. Yes, there could be no doubt that it was only a dream; nevertheless, I think it well to record it here. because it is an additional testimony to the haunting influence under which my brain was beginning to labour. I was sleeping at 2 hours after midnight, and was awakened by a plaintive and continuous murmuring sound. I opened, or I imagined I opened, my eyes. My cabin was in profound darkness. The murmur began again. I listened, and it seemed to me that a voice which I did not know, whispered these words: "Pym, Pym, poor Pym." Evidently this could only be a delusion, unless indeed someone had got into my cabin. The door was locked. "Pym," repeated the voice. "Poor Pym must never be forgotten." This time the words were spoken so close to my ear. And what was the meaning of the injunction, and why was it addressed to me? And besides, had not Pym, after his return to America, met with a sudden and deplorable death, the circumstances or the details being unknown? I began to doubt whether I was in my right mind, and shook myself into complete wakefulness, recognizing that I had been disturbed by an extremely vivid dream due to some cerebral cause. I turned out of my berth, and, pushing back the shutter, looked out of my cabin. No one aft on the deck except Hunt, who was at the helm. I had nothing to do but to lie down again, and this I did. It seemed to me that the name of Arthur Pym was repeated in my hearing several times. Nevertheless, I fell asleep and did not wake until morning, when I retained only a vague impression of this occurrence, which soon faded away. No other incident at that period of our voyage calls for notice. Nothing particular occurred on board our schooner. The breeze from the north which had forsaken us did not recur, and only the An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 15. Bennet Islet. The Halbrane was then within sight of Bennet Islet. The crew urgently needed rest, so the disembarkation was deferred until the following day, and I went back to my cabin. The night passed without disturbance, and when day came not a craft of any kind was visible on the waters, not a native on the beach. There were no huts upon the coast, no smoke arose in the distance to indicate that Bennet Islet was inhabited. But William Guy had not found any trace of human beings there, and what I saw of the islet answered to the description given by Arthur Pym. It rose upon a rocky base of about a league in circumference, and was so arid that no vegetation existed on its surface. "Mr. Jeorling," said Captain Len Guy, "do you observe a promontory in the direction of the northeast?" "I observe it, captain." "Is it not formed of heaped up rocks which look like giant bales of cotton?" "That is so, and just what the narrative describes." "Then all we have to do is to land on the promontory, Mr. Jeorling. Who knows but we may come across some vestige of the crew of the Jane, supposing them to have succeeded in escaping from Tsalal Island." The speaker was devouring the islet with his eyes. What must his thoughts, his desires, his impatience have been? But there was a man whose gaze was set upon the same point even more fixedly. That man was Hunt. Before we left the Halbrane, Len Guy enjoined the most minute and careful watchfulness upon his lieutenant. This was a charge which West did not need. our exploration would take only half a day at most. If the boat had not returned in the afternoon, a second was to be sent in search of us.
"Look sharp also after our recruits," added the captain. "Don't be uneasy, captain," replied the lieutenant. "Indeed, since you want 4 men at the oars, you had better take them from among the new ones. That will leave 4 less troublesome fellows on board."
This was a good idea, for, under the deplorable influence of Hearne, the discontent of his shipmates from the Falklands was on the increase. The boat being ready, 4 of the new crew took their places forward, while Hunt, at his own request, was steersman. Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, and myself, all well armed, seated ourselves aft, and we started for the northern point of the islet. In the course of an hour we had doubled the promontory and come out in sight of a little bay whose shores the boats of the Jane had touched. Hunt steered for this bay, gliding with remarkable skill between the rocky points which stuck up here and there. One would have thought he knew his way among them. We disembarked on a stony coast. The stones were covered with sparse lichen. The tide was already ebbing, leaving uncovered the sandy bottom of a sort of beach strewn with black blocks, resembling big nail heads. 2 men were left in charge of the boat while we landed amid the rocks, and, accompanied by the other 2, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Hunt, and I, proceeded towards the centre, where we found some rising ground from whence we could see the whole extent of the islet. But there was nothing to be seen on any side, absolutely nothing. On coming down from the slight eminence, Hunt went on in front, as it had been agreed that he was to be our guide. We followed him, therefore, as he led us towards the southern extremity of the islet. Having reached the point, Hunt looked carefully on all sides of him, then stooped and showed us a piece of half rotten wood lying among the scattered stones.
"I remember!"
I exclaimed. "Arthur Pym speaks of a piece of wood with traces of carving on it which appeared to have belonged to the bow of a ship."
"Among the carving my brother fancied he could trace the design of a tortoise," added Captain Len Guy.
"Just so," I replied, "but Arthur Pym pronounced that resemblance doubtful. No matter, the piece of wood is still in the same place that is indicated in the narrative. So we may conclude that since the Jane cast anchor here, no other crew has set foot upon Bennet Islet. It follows that we should only lose time in looking out for any tokens of another landing. We shall know nothing until we reach Tsalal Island."
"Yes, Tsalal Island,"
replied the captain. We then retraced our steps in the direction of the bay. In various places we observed fragments of coral reef, and bêche de mer was so abundant that our schooner might have taken a full cargo of it. Hunt walked on in silence, with downcast eyes, until, as we were close enough upon the beach to the east, he, being about 10 paces ahead, stopped abruptly, and summoned us to him by a hurried gesture. In an instant we were by his side. Hunt had evinced no surprise on the subject of the piece of wood first found, but his attitude changed when he knelt down in front of a worm-eaten plank lying on the sand. He felt it all over with his huge hands, as though he were seeking some tracery on its rough surface whose signification might be intelligible to him. The black paint was hidden under the thick dirt that had accumulated upon it. The plank had probably formed part of a ship's stern, as the boatswain requested us to observe.
"Yes, yes," repeated Captain Len Guy, "it made part of a stern."
Hunt, who still remained kneeling, nodded his big head in assent. "But," I remarked, "this plank must have been cast upon Bennet Islet from a wreck. The cross currents must have found it in the open sea, and—"
"If that were so!" cried the captain.
The same thought had occurred to both of us. What was our surprise, indeed our amazement, our unspeakable emotion, when Hunt showed us 8 letters, cut in the plank, not painted, but hollow and distinctly traceable with the finger. It was only too easy to recognize the letters of two names arranged in two lines, thus: A.N. L.I.E.P.O.L. The Jane of the Liverpool, the schooner commanded by Captain William Guy. What did it matter that time had blurred the other letters? Did not those suffice to tell the name of the ship and the port she belonged to? The Jane of the Liverpool. Captain Len Guy had taken the plank in his hands, and now he pressed his lips to it, while tears fell from his eyes. It was a fragment of the Jane. I did not utter a word until the captain's emotion had subsided. As for Hunt, I had never seen such a lightning glance from his brilliant hawk-like eyes as he now cast towards the southern horizon. Captain Len Guy rose. Hunt, without a word, placed the plank on his shoulder, and we continued our route. When we had made the tour of the island, we halted at the place where the boat had been left under the charge of two sailors, and about half past 2 in the afternoon we were again on board. Early on in the morning of the 23rd of December, the Halbrane put off from Bennet Islet, and we carried away with us new and convincing testimony to the catastrophe which Tsalal Island had witnessed. During the day I observed the sea water very attentively, and it seemed to me less deeply blue than Arthur Pym describes it. Nor had we met a single specimen of his monster of the austral fauna, an animal 3 feet long, 6 inches high, with 4 short legs, long coral claws, a silky body, a rat's tail, a cat's head, the hanging ears, blood-red lips, and white teeth of a dog. The truth is that I regarded several of these details as suspect, and entirely due to an over-imaginative temperament. Seated far aft in the ship, I read Edgar Poe's book with sedulous attention, but I was not unaware of the fact that Hunt, whenever his duties furnished him with an opportunity, observed me pertinaciously, and with looks of singular meaning. And, in fact, I was reperusing the end of chapter 17, in which Arthur Pym acknowledged his responsibility for the sad and tragic events which were the result of his advice. It was, in fact, he who over-persuaded Captain William Guy, urging him to profit by so tempting an opportunity of solving the great problem relating to the Antarctic continent. And besides, while accepting that responsibility, did he not congratulate himself on having been the instrument of a great discovery, and having aided in some degree to reveal to science one of the most marvellous secrets which An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 16. Tsalal Island. The night passed without alarm. No boat had put off from the island, nor had a native shown himself upon the beach. The Halbrane, then, had not been observed on her arrival. This was all the better. We had cast anchor in 10 fathoms, at 3 miles from the coast. When the Jane appeared in these waters, The people of Tsalal beheld a ship for the first time, and they took it for an enormous animal, regarding its masts as limbs and its sails as garments. Now they ought to be better informed on this subject, and if they did not attempt to visit us, to what motive were we to assign such conduct? Captain Len Guy gave orders for the lowering of the ship's largest boat in a voice which betrayed his impatience. The order was executed, and the captain, addressing West, said: "Send 8 men down, with Martin Holt. Send Hunt to the helm. Remain yourself at the moorings, and keep a look-out landwards as well as to sea." "Aye, aye, sir. Don't be uneasy." "We are going ashore, and we shall try to gain the village of Klock Klock. If any difficulty should arise on sea, give us warning by firing 3 shots." "All right," replied West, "at a minute's interval." "If we should not return before evening, send the second boat with 10 armed men under the boatswain's orders, and let them station themselves within a cable's length of the shore, so as to escort us back. You understand?" "Perfectly, captain." "If we are not to be found, after you have done all in your power, you will take command of the schooner and bring her back to the Falklands." "I will do so." The large boat was rapidly got ready. 8 men embarked in it, including Martin Holt and Hunt, all armed with rifles, pistols, and knives. The latter weapons were slung in their belts. They also carried cartridge pouches. I stepped forward and said: "Will you not allow me to accompany you, captain?" "If you wish to do so, Mr. Jeorling." I went to my cabin, took my gun, a repeating rifle with ball and powder, and rejoined Captain Len Guy, who had kept a place in the stern of the boat for me. Our object was to discover the passage through which Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters had crossed the reef on the 19th of January, 1828, in the Jane's boat. For 20 minutes we rowed along the reef, and then Hunt discovered the pass, which was through a narrow cut in the rocks. Leaving 2 men in the boat, we landed, and having gone through the winding gorge which gave access to the crest of the coast, our little force, headed by Hunt, pushed on towards the centre of the island. Captain Len Guy and myself exchanged observations as we walked, on the subject of this country, which, as Arthur Pym declared, differed essentially from every other land hitherto visited by human beings. We soon found that Pym's description was trustworthy. The general colour of the plains was black, as though the clay were made of lava dust. Nowhere was anything white to be seen. At 100 paces distance, Hunt began to run towards an enormous mass of rock, climbed on it with great agility, and looked out over a wide extent of space like a man who ought to recognize the place he is in, but does not. "What is the matter with him?" asked Captain Len Guy, who was observing Hunt attentively. "I don't know what is the matter with him, captain, but, as you are aware, everything about this man is odd. His ways are inexplicable, and on certain sides of him he seems to belong to those strange beings whom Arthur Pym asserts that he found on this island. One would even say that—" "That?" repeated the captain. And then, without finishing my sentence, I said: "Captain, are you sure you made a good observation when you took the altitude yesterday?" "Certainly." "So that your point—" "Gave 83 degrees 20 minutes of latitude, and 43 degrees 5 minutes of longitude." "Exactly?" "Exactly." "There is, then, no doubt that we are on Tsalal Island?" "None, Mr. Jeorling, if Tsalal Island lies where Arthur Pym places it." This was quite true. There could be no doubt on the point, and yet of all that Arthur Pym described nothing existed, or rather nothing was any longer to be seen. Not a tree, not a shrub, not a plant was visible in the landscape. There was no sign of the wooded hills between which the village of Klock Klock ought to lie, or of the streams from which the crew of the Jane had not ventured to drink. There was no water anywhere, but everywhere absolute, awful drought. Nevertheless, Hunt walked on rapidly, without showing any hesitation. It seemed as though he was led by a natural instinct, a bee's flight, as we say in America. I know not what presentiment induced us to follow him as the best of guides, a Chingachgook, a Renard Subtil. And why not? Was not he the fellow countryman of Fenimore Cooper's heroes? But I must repeat that we had not before our eyes that fabulous land which Arthur Pym described. The soil we were treading had been ravaged, wrecked, torn by convulsion. It was black, a cindery black, as though it had been vomited from the earth under the action of Plutonian forces. It suggested that some appalling and irresistible cataclysm had overturned the whole of its surface. Not one of the animals mentioned in the narrative was to be seen, and even the penguins which abound in the Antarctic regions had fled from this uninhabitable land. Its stern silence and solitude made it a hideous desert. No human being was to be seen either on the coast or in the interior. Did any chance of finding William Guy and the survivors of the Jane exist in the midst of this scene of desolation? I looked at Captain Len Guy. His pale face, dim eyes, and knit brow told too plainly that hope was beginning to die within his breast. And then the population of Tsalal Island, the almost naked men, armed with clubs and lances, the tall, well-made, upstanding women, endowed with grace and freedom of bearing not to be found in a civilized society. Those are the expressions of Arthur Pym, and the crowd of children accompanying them. What had become of all these? Where were the multitude of natives with black skins, black hair, black teeth, who regarded white colour with deadly terror? All of a sudden a light flashed upon me. "An earthquake!" I exclaimed. "Yes, 2 or 3 of those terrible shocks, so common in these regions where the sea penetrates by infiltration, and a day comes when the quantity of accumulated vapour makes its way out and destroys everything on the surface." "Could an earthquake have changed Tsalal Island to such an extent?" asked Len Guy, musingly. "Yes, captain, an earthquake has done this thing. It has destroyed every trace of all that Arthur Pym saw here." Hunt, who had drawn nigh to us, and was listening, nodded his head in approval of my words. "Are these not countries of the southern seas volcanic?" I resumed. "If the Halbrane were to transport us to Victoria Island, we might find the Erebus and the Terror in the midst of an eruption." "And yet," observed Martin Holt, "if there had been an eruption here, we should find lava beds." "I did not say there has been an eruption," I replied, "but I do say the soil has been convulsed by an earthquake." On reflection it will be seen that the explanation given by me deserved to be admitted. And then it came to my remembrance that according to Arthur Pym's narrative, Tsalal belonged to a group of islands which extended towards the west. Unless the people of Tsalal had been destroyed, it was possible that they might have fled into one of the neighbouring islands. We should do well, then, to go and reconnoitre that archipelago, for Tsalal clearly had no resources whatever to offer after the cataclysm. I spoke of this to the captain. "Yes," he replied, and tears stood in his eyes. "Yes, it may be so. And yet, how could my brother and his unfortunate companions have found the means of escaping? Is it not far more probable that they all perished in the earthquake?" Here Hunt made us a signal to follow him, and we did so. After he had pushed across the valley for a considerable distance, he stopped. What a spectacle was before our eyes! There, lying in heaps, were human bones, all the fragments of that framework of humanity which we call the skeleton, hundreds of them, without a particle of flesh, clusters of skulls, still bearing some tufts of hair. A vast bone heap, dried and whitened in this place. We were struck dumb and motionless by this spectacle. When Captain Len Guy could speak, he murmured, "My brother, my poor brother!" On a little reflection, however, my mind refused to admit certain things. How was this catastrophe to be reconciled with Patterson's memoranda? The entries in his note book stated explicitly that the mate of the Jane had left his companions on Tsalal Island 7 months previously. They could not have perished in this earthquake, for the state of the bones proved that it had taken place several years earlier, and must have occurred after the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, since no mention of it was made in the narrative of the former. These facts, then, were irreconcilable. If the earthquake was of recent date, the presence of those time-bleached skeletons could not be attributed to its action. In any case, the survivors of the Jane were not among them. But then, where were they? The valley of Klock Klock extended no farther. We had to retrace our steps in order to regain the coast. We had hardly gone half a mile on the cliff's edge when Hunt again stopped, on perceiving some fragments of bone which were turning to dust, and did not seem to be those of a human being. Were these the remains of one of the strange animals described by Arthur Pym, of which we had not hitherto seen any specimens? Hunt suddenly uttered a cry, or rather a sort of savage growl, and held out his enormous hand, holding a metal collar. Yes, a brass collar, a collar eaten by rust, but bearing letters which might still be deciphered. These letters formed the 3 following words: Tiger, Arthur Pym. Tiger! The name of the dog which had saved Arthur Pym's life in the hold of the Grampus, and, during the revolt of the crew, had sprung at the throat of Jones, the sailor, and who was immediately finished by Dirk Peters. So, then, that faithful animal had not perished in the shipwreck of the Grampus. He had been taken on board the Jane at the same time as Arthur Pym and the half-breed, and yet the narrative did not allude to this. And after the meeting with the schooner there was no longer any mention of the dog. All these contradictions occurred to me. I could not reconcile the facts. Nevertheless, there could be no doubt that Tiger had been saved from the shipwreck like Arthur Pym, had escaped the landslip of the Klock Klock Hill, and had come to his death at last in the catastrophe which had destroyed a portion of the population of Tsalal. But again, William Guy and his 5 sailors could not be among those skeletons which were strewn upon the earth, since they were living at the time of Patterson's departure 7 months ago, and the catastrophe already dated several years back. 3 hours later we had returned on board the Halbrane, without having made any other discovery. Captain Len Guy went direct to his cabin, shut himself up there, and did not reappear even at dinner hour. The following day, as I wished to return to the island in order to resume its exploration from one coast to the other, I requested West to have me rowed ashore. He consented, after he had been authorized by Captain Len Guy, who did not come out with us. Hunt, the boatswain, Martin Holt, 4 men, and myself took our places in the boat without arms, for there was no longer anything to fear. We disembarked at our yesterday's landing place, and Hunt again led the way towards the hill of Klock Klock. Nothing remained of the eminence that had been carried away in the artificial landslip from which the captain of the Jane, Patterson, his second officer, and 5 of his men had happily escaped. The village of Klock Klock had thus disappeared, and doubtless the mystery of the strange discoveries narrated in Arthur Poe's work was now and ever would remain beyond solution. We had only to regain our ship, returning by the east side of the coast. Hunt brought us through the space where the sheds had been erected for the preparation of the bêche de mer, and we saw the remains of them. On all sides silence and abandonment reigned. We made a brief pause at the place where Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters seized upon the boat which bore them towards higher latitudes, even to that horizon of dark vapour whose rents permitted them to discern the huge human figure, the white giant. Hunt stood with crossed arms, his eyes devouring the vast extent of the sea. "Well, Hunt?" said I tentatively. Hunt did not appear to hear me. He did not turn his head in my direction. "What are we doing here?" I asked him, and touched him on the shoulder. He started, and cast a glance upon me which went to my heart. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 17. Part 1. And Pym. And Pym, poor Pym! I turned round quickly. Hunt had spoken. This strange person was standing motionless at a little distance, gazing fixedly at the horizon. It was so unusual to hear Hunt's voice on board the schooner, that the men whom the unaccustomed sound reached drew near, moved by curiosity. Did not this unexpected intervention point to, I had a presentiment that it did, some wonderful revelation? A movement of West's hand sent the men forward, leaving only the mate, the boatswain, Martin Holt, the sailing master, and Hardy, with the captain and myself in the vicinity of Hunt. The captain approached and addressed him. "What did you say?" "I said, and Pym, poor Pym." "Well, then, what do you mean by repeating the name of the man whose pernicious advice led my brother to the island on which the Jane was lost, the greater part of her crew was massacred, and where we have not found even one left of those who were still here 7 months ago?" Hunt did not speak. "Answer! I say answer!" cried the captain. Hunt hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but from a certain difficulty in expressing his ideas. The latter were quite clear, but his speech was confused, his words were unconnected. He had a certain language of his own, which sometimes was picturesque, and pronunciation was strongly marked by the hoarse accent of the Indians of the far west. "You see," he said, "I do not know how to tell things. My tongue stops. Understand me. I spoke of Pym, poor Pym, did I not?" "Yes," answered West sternly,
And what have you to say about Arthur Pym?" "I have to say that he must not be abandoned." "Abandoned!" I exclaimed. "No, never. It would be cruel, too cruel. We must go to seek him." "To seek him?" repeated Captain Len Guy. "Understand me. It is for this that I have embarked on the Halbrane. Yes, to find poor Pym." "And where is he," I asked, "if not in a deep grave in the cemetery of his natal city?" "No, he is in a place where he remained, alone, all alone," continued Hunt, pointing towards the south, "and since then the sun has risen on that horizon 7 times." It was evident that Hunt intended to designate the Antarctic regions, but what did he mean by this? "Do you not know that Arthur Pym is dead?" said the captain. "Dead?" replied Hunt, emphasizing the word with an expressive gesture. "No. Listen to me. I know things. Understand me. He is not dead." "Come now, Hunt," said I, "remember what you do know. In the last chapter of the adventures of Arthur Pym, does not Edgar Poe relate his sudden and deplorable end?" "Explain yourself, Hunt," said the captain, in a tone of command. "Reflect, take your time, and say plainly whatever you have to say." And while Hunt passed his hand over his brow, as though to collect his memory of far off things, I observed to Captain Len Guy, "There is something very singular in the intervention of this man, if indeed he be not mad." At my words the boatswain shook his head, for he did not believe Hunt to be in his right mind. The latter understood this shake of the boatswain's head, and cried out in a harsh tone, "No, not mad! And madmen are respected on the prairies, even if they are not believed. And I must be believed. No, 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 Pym is not dead." "Edgar Poe asserts that he is," I replied. "Yes, I know, Edgar Poe of Baltimore, but he never saw poor Pym, never, never." "What!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "The two men were not acquainted?" "No." "And it was not Arthur Pym himself who related his adventures to Poe?" "No, captain, no. He below there, at Baltimore, had only the notes written by Pym from the day when he hid himself on board the Grampus, to the very last hour, the last, understand me, the last." "Who, then, brought back the journal?" asked Captain Len Guy, as he seized Hunt's hand. "It was Pym's companion, he who loved him, his poor Pym, like a son. It was Dirk Peters, the half breed, who came back alone from there, beyond." "The half breed Dirk Peters!" I exclaimed. "Yes." "Alone?" "Alone." "And Arthur Pym may be " "There," answered Hunt, in a loud voice, bending towards the southern line, from which he had not diverted his gaze for a moment. Could such an assertion prevail against the general incredulity? No, assuredly not. Martin Holt nudged Hurliguerly with his elbow, and both regarded Hunt with pity, while West observed him without speaking. Captain Len Guy made me a sign, meaning that nothing serious was to be got of this poor fellow, whose mental faculties must have been out of gear for a long time. And nevertheless, when I looked keenly at Hunt, it seemed to me that a sort of radiance of truth shone out of his eyes. Then I set to work to interrogate the man, putting him to precise and pressing questions, which he tried to answer categorically, as we shall see, and not once did he contradict himself. "Tell me," I asked, "did Arthur Pym really come to Tsalal Island on board the Grampus?" "Yes." "Did Arthur Pym separate himself with the half breed and one of the sailors from his companions while Captain William Guy had gone to the village of Klock Klock?" "Yes. The sailor was one Allen, and he was almost immediately stifled under the stones." "Then the two others saw the attack and the destruction of the schooner from the top of the hill?" "Yes." "Then, some time later, the two left the island, after they had got possession of one of the boats which the natives could not take from them?" Yes. And after 20 days, having reached the front of the curtain of vapour, they were both carried down into the gulf of the cataract? This time Hunt did not reply in the affirmative. He hesitated. He stammered out some vague words. He seemed to be trying to rekindle the half extinguished flame of his memory. At length, looking at me and shaking his head, he answered, "No, not both. Understand me, Dirk never told me." "Dirk Peters?" interposed Captain Len Guy quickly. "You knew Dirk Peters?" "Yes." "Where?" "At Vandalia, State of Illinois." "And it is from him that you have all this information concerning the voyage?" "From him." "And he came back alone from that voyage, having left Arthur Pym?" "Alone." "Speak, man, do speak!" I cried impatiently. Then, in broken but intelligible sentences, Hunt spoke. "Yes, there a curtain of vapour, so the half breed often said. Understand me. The two, Arthur Pym and he, were in Tsalal boat. Then an enormous block of ice came full upon them, and at the shock Dirk Peters was thrown into the sea. But he clung to the ice block, and understand me, he saw the boat drift with the current, far, very far, too far. In vain did Pym try to rejoin his companion. He could not. The boat drifted on, and Pym, that poor dear Pym, was carried away. It is he who has never come back, and he is there, still there." If Hunt had been the half breed in person, he could not have spoken with more heartfelt emotion of poor Pym. It was then, in front of the curtain of vapour, that Arthur Pym and the half breed had been separated from each other. Dirk Peters had succeeded in returning from the ice world to America, whither he conveyed the notes that were communicated to Edgar Poe. Hunt was minutely questioned upon all these points, and he replied, conformably, he declared, to what the half breed had told him many times. According to this statement, Dirk Peters had Arthur Pym's notebook in his pocket at the moment when the ice block struck them, and thus the journal which the half breed placed at the disposal of the American romance writer was saved. "Understand me," Hunt repeated, "for I tell you things as I have them from Dirk Peters. While the drift was carrying him away he cried out with all his strength. Pym, poor Pym, had already disappeared in the midst of the vapour. The half breed, feeding upon raw fish which he contrived to catch, was carried back by a cross current to Tsalal Island, where he landed, half dead from hunger." "To Tsalal Island!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "And how long was it since they had left it?" 3 weeks, yes, 3 weeks at the furthest, so Dirk Peters told me." "Then he must have found all that remained of the crew of the Jane, my brother William, and those who had survived with him?" "No," replied Hunt, "and Dirk Peters always believed that they had perished. Yes, to the very last man. There was no one upon the island." "No one?" "Not a living soul." "But the population?" "No one. No one, I tell you. The island was a desert. Yes, a desert." This statement contradicted certain facts of which we were absolutely certain. After all, though, when Dirk Peters returned to Tsalal Island, the population, seized by who can tell what terror, had already taken refuge upon the south-western group, and that William Guy and his companions were still hidden in the gorges of Klock Klock. That would explain why half breed had not come across them, and also why survivors of the Jane had nothing to fear during 11 years of their sojourn on the island. On the other hand, since Patterson had left them there 7 previously, if we did not find them, that must have been because they had been obliged to leave Tsalal Island, it being rendered uninhabitable by the earthquake. "So that," resumed Captain Len Guy, "on the return of Dirk Peters there is no longer an inhabitant on the island?" "Not one," repeated Hunt. "Not one." The half-breed did not meet a single native." "And what did Dirk Peters do?" "Understand me. A forsaken boat lay there at the back of the bay, contained some dried meat and several casks of water. The half breed got into it, and a south wind, yes, south, very strong, the same that had driven the ice block with the cross current towards Tsalal Island, carried him on for weeks and weeks to the ice barrier, through a passage in it. You may believe me, I am telling you only what Dirk Peters told me, and he cleared the polar circle." "And beyond it?" I inquired. "Beyond it, he was picked up by an American whaler, the Sandy Hook, and taken back to America." Now one thing at all events was clear. Edgar Poe had never known Arthur Pym. This was the reason why, to leave his readers in exciting uncertainty, he had brought Pym to an end as sudden as it was deplorable, without indicating the manner or the cause of his death. And yet, although Arthur Pym did not return, could it be reasonably admitted that he had survived his companion for any length of time, that he was still living, 11 years having elapsed since his disappearance? "Yes, yes," replied Hunt. And this he affirmed with the strong conviction that Dirk Peters had infused into his mind while the two were living together in Vandalia, in Illinois. Now the question arose, was Hunt sane? Was it not he who had stolen into my cabin in a fit of insanity? Of this I had no doubt, and murmured in my ear the words, "And Pym, poor Pym." Yes, and I had not been dreaming. In short, if all that Hunt had said was true, if he was but the faithful reporter of secrets which had been entrusted to him by Dirk Peters, ought he to be believed when he repeated in a tone of mingled command and entreaty, "Pym is not dead. Pym is there. Poor Pym must not be forsaken." When I had made an end of questioning Hunt, Captain Len Guy came out of his meditative mood, profoundly troubled, and gave the word, "All hands forward!" When the men were assembled around him, he said, "Listen to me, Hunt, and seriously consider the gravity of the questions I am about to put to you." Hunt held his head up, and ran his eyes over the crew of the Halbrane. "You assert, Hunt, that all you have told us concerning Arthur Pym is true?" "Yes." "You knew Dirk Peters?" "Yes." "You lived some years with him in Illinois?" "9 years." "And he often related these things to you?" "Yes." "And for your own part you have no doubt that he told you the exact truth?" "None." "Well, then, did it ever occur to him that some of the crew of the Jane might have remained on Tsalal Island?" "No." "He believed that Captain William Guy and his companions must all have perished in the landslip of the hill of Klock Klock?" "Yes, and from what he often repeated to me, Pym believed it also." "Where did you see Dirk Peters for the last time?" "At Vandalia." "How long ago?" "Over 2 years." "And which of you two was the first to leave Vandalia?" I thought I detected a slight hesitation in Hunt before he answered. "We left the place together." "You to go to?" "The Falklands." "And he?" "He?" replied Hunt. And then his wandering gaze fixed itself on Martin Holt, our sailing master, whose life he had saved at the risk of his own during the tempest. "Well," resumed the captain, "do you not understand what I am asking you?" "Yes." "Then answer me. When Dirk Peters left Illinois, did he finally give up America?" "Yes." "To go whither? Speak!" "To the Falklands." "And where is he now?" "He stands before you." Dirk Peters? Hunt was the half breed Dirk Peters, the devoted companion of Arthur Pym, he whom Captain Guy had so long sought for in the United States, and whose presence was probably to furnish us with a fresh reason for pursuing our daring campaign.
I shall not at all be surprised if my readers have already recognized Dirk Peters and Hunt. Indeed, I shall be astonished if they have failed to do so. The extraordinary thing is that Captain Len Guy and myself, who had read Edgar Poe's book over and over again, did not see at once, when Hunt came on the ship at the Falklands, that he and the half breed were identical. I can only admit that we were both blindfolded by some hidden action of fate, just when certain pages of that book ought to have effectually cleared our vision. There was no doubt whatever that Hunt really was Dirk Peters. Although he was 11 years older, he answered in every particular to the description of him given by Arthur Pym, except that he was no longer of fierce aspect. In fact, the half breed had changed with age, and the experience of terrible scenes through which he had passed. Nevertheless, he was still the faithful companion to whom Arthur Pym had often owed his Chapter 17, Part-02, and Pym. At length, moved by irresistible impulse, I said: "My friends, before any decision is made, let us carefully consider the situation. Should we not lay up everlasting regret for ourselves if we were to abandon our expedition at the very moment when it promises to succeed? Reflect upon this, captain, and you, my companions. It is less than 7 months since Patterson left your countrymen alive on Tsalal Island. If they were there then, the fact proves that for 11 years they have been enabled to exist on the resources provided by the island, having nothing to fear from the islanders, some of whom had fallen victim to circumstances unknown to us, and others had probably transferred themselves to some neighbouring island. This is quite plain, and I do not see how any objection can be raised to my reasoning." No one made answer. There was none to be made. "If we have not come across the captain of the Jane and his people," I resumed, "it is because they have been obliged to abandon Tsalal Island since Patterson's departure. Why? In my belief it was because the earthquake had rendered the island uninhabitable. Now they would only have required a native boat to gain either another island or some point of the Antarctic continent by the aid of the southern current. I hardly hesitate to assert that all this has occurred. But in any case, I know, and I repeat, that we shall have done nothing if we do not persevere in the search on which the safety of your countrymen depends." I questioned my audience by a searching look. No answer. Captain Len Guy, whose emotion was unrestrained, bowed his head, for he felt that I was right, that by invoking the duties of humanity I was prescribing the only course open to men with feeling hearts. "And what is in question?" I continued, after the silent pause. "To accomplish a few degrees of latitude, and that while the sea is open, while we have 2 months of good weather to look for, and nothing to fear from the southern winter. I certainly should not ask you to brave its severity. And shall we hesitate when the Halbrane is abundantly furnished, her crew complete and in good health? Shall we take fright at imaginary dangers? Shall we not have courage to go on thither?" And I pointed to the southern horizon. Dirk Peters pointed to it also, with an imperative gesture which spoke for him. Still the eyes of all were fixed upon us, but there was no response. I continued to urge every argument, and to quote every example in favour of the safety of pursuing our voyage, but the silence was unbroken, and now the men stood with eyes cast down. And yet I had not once pronounced the name of Dirk Peters, nor alluded to Dirk Peters' proposal. I was asking myself whether I had or had not succeeded in inspiring my companions with my own belief, when Captain Len Guy spoke. "Dirk Peters," he said, "do you assert that Arthur Pym and you, after your departure from Tsalal Island, saw land in the direction of the south?" "Yes, land," answered the half breed. "Islands or continents, understand me. And I believe that Pym, poor Pym, is waiting there until aid comes to him." "There, where perhaps William Guy and his companions are also waiting," said I, to bring back the discussion to more practical points. Captain Len Guy reflected for a little while, and then spoke. "Is it true, Dirk Peters," he asked, "that beyond the 84th parallel the horizon is shut in by that curtain of vapour which is described in the narrative? Have you seen with your own eyes, those cataracts in the air, that gulf in which Arthur Pym's boat was lost?" The half breed looked from one to the other of us, and shook his big head. "I don't know," he said. "What are you asking me about, captain? A curtain of vapour? Yes, perhaps, and also appearances of land towards the south." Evidently Dirk Peters had never read Edgar Poe's book, and very likely did not know how to read. After having handed over Pym's journal, he had not troubled himself about its publication. Having retired to Illinois at first, and to the Falklands afterwards, he had no notion of the stir that the work had made, or of the fantastic and base-line climax to which our great poet had brought those strange adventurers. And besides, might not Arthur Pym himself, with his tendency to the supernatural, have fancied that he saw these wondrous things, due solely to his imaginative brain? Then, for the first time in the course of this discussion, West's voice made itself heard. I had no idea which side he would take. The first words he uttered were, "Captain, your orders?" Captain Len Guy turned towards his crew, who surrounded him, both the old and the new. Hearne remained in the background, ready to intervene if he should think it necessary. The captain questioned the boatswain and his comrades, whose devotion was unreservedly his, by a long and anxious look, and I heard him mutter between his teeth, "Ah, if it depended only on me, if I were sure of the assent and the help of them all!" Then Hearne spoke roughly. "Captain," said he, "it is 2 months since we left the Falklands. Now my companions were engaged for a voyage which was not to take them further beyond the icebergs than Tsalal Island."
"That is not so!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "No, that is not so. I recruited you all for an enterprise which I have a right to pursue so far as I please." "Beg pardon," said Hearne, coolly, "but we have come to a point which no navigator has ever yet reached, in a sea no ship except the Jane has ever ventured into before us, and therefore my comrades and I mean to return to the Falklands before the bad season. From there you can return to Tsalal Island, and even go on to the Pole if you so please." A murmur of approbation greeted his words. No doubt the sealing master justly interpreted the sentiments of the majority, composed of the new recruits. To go against their opinion, to exact the obedience of these ill disposed men, and under such conditions to risk the unknown Antarctic waters, would have been an act of temerity, or rather an act of madness, that would have brought about some catastrophe. Nevertheless, West, advancing upon Hearne, said to him in a threatening tone, "Who gave you leave to speak?" "The captain questioned us," replied Hearne. "I had a right to reply." The man uttered these words with such insolence that West, who was generally so self restrained, was about to give free vent to his wrath, when Captain Len Guy, stopping him by a motion of his hand, said quietly, "Be calm, Jem. Nothing can be done unless we are all agreed. What is your opinion, Hurliguerly?" "It is very clear, captain," replied the boatswain. "I will obey your orders, whatever they may be. It is our duty not to forsake William Guy and the others so long as any chance of saving them remains." The boatswain paused for a moment, while several of the sailors gave unequivocal signs of approbation. "As for what concerns Arthur Pym—" "There is no question of Arthur Pym," struck in the captain, "but only of my brother William and his companions." I saw at this moment that Dirk Peters was about to protest, and caught hold of his arm. He shook with anger, but kept silence. The captain continued his questioning of the men, desiring to know by name all those upon whom he might reckon. The old crew to a man acquiesced in his proposals, and pledged themselves to obey his orders implicitly, and follow him whithersoever he chose to go. 3 only of the recruits joined those faithful seamen. These were English sailors. The others were of Hearne's opinion, holding that for them the campaign was ended at Tsalal Island. They therefore refused to go beyond that point, and formally demanded that the ship should be steered northward, so as to clear the icebergs at the most favourable period of the season. 20 men were on their side, and to constrain them to lend a hand to the working of the ship if she were to be diverted to the south, would have been to provoke them to rebel. There was but one resource to arouse their covetousness, to strike the chord of self-interest. I intervened, therefore, and addressed them in a way which placed the seriousness of my proposal beyond a doubt. "Men of the Halbrane, listen to me. Just as various states have done for voyages of discovery in the polar regions, I offer a reward to the crew of this schooner. $2,000 shall be shared among you for every degree we make beyond the 84th parallel. Nearly $70 to each man. This was a strong temptation. I felt that I had hit the mark. "I will sign an agreement to that effect," I continued, "with Captain Len Guy as your representative, and the sums gained shall be handed to you on your return, no matter under what conditions that return be accomplished." I waited for the effect of this promise, and, to tell the truth, I had not long to wait. "Hurrah!" cried the boatswain, acting as fugleman to his comrades, who almost unanimously added their cheers to his. Hearne offered no further opposition. It would always be in his power to put in his word when the stances should be more propitious.
Thus the bargain was made, and, to gain my ends, I have made a heavier sacrifice. It is true we were within 7° of the south, and if the Halbrane should indeed reach that spot, it would never cost me more than $14,000. Early in the morning of the 27th of December, the Halbrane put out to sea, heading south-west. After the scene of the preceding evening, Captain Len Guy had taken a few hours' rest. I met him the next day on deck, while West was going about fore and aft, and he called us both to him. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "it was with a terrible pang that I came to the resolution to bring our schooner back to the north. I felt I had not done all I ought to do for our unhappy fellow countrymen, but I knew that the majority of the crew would be against me if I insisted on going beyond Tsalal Island." "That is true, captain. There was a beginning of indiscipline on board, and perhaps it might have ended in a revolt." "A revolt we should have speedily put down," said West, coolly, "were it only by knocking Hearne, who is always exciting the mutinous men, on the head." "And you would have done well, Jem," said the captain. "Only justice being satisfied, what would have become of the agreement together, which we must have in order to do anything?" "Of course, captain, it is better that things passed off without violence. But for the future, Hearne will have to look out for himself." "His companions," observed the captain, "are now greedy for the prizes that have been promised them. The greed of gain will make them more willing and persevering. The generosity of Mr. Jeorling has succeeded where our entreaties would undoubtedly have failed. I thank him for it." Captain Len Guy held out a hand to me, which I grasped cordially. After some general conversation relating to our purpose, the ship's course, and the proposed verification of the bearings of the group of islands on the west of Tsalal, which is described by Arthur Pym, the captain said: "As it is possible that the ravages of the earthquake did not extend to this group, and that it may still be inhabited, we must be on our guard in approaching the bearings." "Which cannot be far off," I added. "And then, captain, who knows but that your brother and his sailors might have taken refuge on one of these islands?" This was admissible, but not a consoling eventuality, for in that case the poor fellows would have fallen into the hands of those savages of whom they were rid while they remained at Tsalal. "Jem," resumed Captain Len Guy, "we are making good way, and no doubt land will be signalled in a few hours. Give orders for the watch to be careful." "It's done, captain." "There's a man in the crow's nest?" "Dirk Peters himself, at his own request." "All right, Jem. We may trust his vigilance." "And also his eyes," I added, "for he is gifted with amazing sight." For 2 hours of quick sailing, not the smallest indication of the group of 8 islands was visible. "It is incomprehensible that we could not come in sight of them," said the captain. "I reckon that the Halbrane has made 60 miles since this morning, and the islands in question are tolerably close together." "Then, captain, we must conclude, and it is not unlikely, that the group to which Tsalal belonged has entirely disappeared in the earthquake." "Land ahead!" cried Dirk Peters. We looked, but could discern nothing on the sea. Nor was it until a quarter of an hour had elapsed that our glasses enabled us to recognize the tops of a few scattered islets shining in the oblique rays of the sun 2 or 3 miles to the westward. What a change! How had it come about? Arthur Pym described spacious islands, but only a small number of tiny islets, half a dozen at most, protruded from the waters. At this moment the half breed came sliding down from his lofty perch, and jumped to the deck. "Well, Dirk Peters, have you recognized the group?" asked the captain. "The group?" replied the half breed, shaking his head.
No, I have only seen the tops of 5 or 6 islets. There is nothing but stone heaps there, not a single island." As the schooner approached we easily recognized these fragments of the group which had been almost entirely destroyed on its western side. The scattered remains formed dangerous reefs, which might seriously injure the keel or the sides of the Halbrane, and there was no intention of risking the ship's safety among them. We accordingly cast anchor at a safe distance, and a boat was lowered for the reception of Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Dirk Peters, Holt, 2 men, and myself. The still, transparent water, as Peters steered us skilfully between the projecting edges of the little reefs, allowed us to see, not a bed of sand strewn with shells, but heaps which were overgrown by land vegetation, tufts, plants not belonging to the marine flora that floated on the surface of the sea. Presently we landed on one of the larger islets, which rose to about 30 feet above the sea. "Do the tides rise sometimes to that height?" I inquired of the captain. "Never," he replied, "and perhaps we shall discover some remains of the vegetable kingdom, of habitations, or of an encampment." "The best thing that we can do," said the boatswain, "is to follow Dirk Peters, who has already distanced us. The half breed's lynx's eyes will see what we can't." Peters had indeed scaled the eminence in a moment, and we presently joined him on the top. The An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 18, Part 1. A Revelation. The following day, the 29th of December, at 6 in the morning, the schooner set sail with a north-east wind, and this time her course was due south. The 2 succeeding days passed wholly without incident. Neither land nor any sign of land was observed. The men on the Halbrane took great hauls of fish, to their own satisfaction and ours. It was New Year's Day, 1840, 4 months and 17 days since I had left the Kerguelens, and 2 months and 5 days since the Halbrane had sailed from the Falklands. The half breed, between whom and myself an odd kind of tacit understanding subsisted, approached the bench on which I was sitting. The captain was in his cabin, and West was not in sight, with a plain intention of conversing with me. The subject may easily be guessed. "Dirk Peters," said I,
taking up the subject at once. "Do you wish that we should talk of him?" "Him," he murmured. "You have remained faithful to his memory, Dirk Peters." "Forget him, sir? Never!" "He is always there before you?" "Always. So many dangers shared. That makes brothers. No, it makes a father and his son. Yes, and I have seen America again. But Pym, poor Pym, he is still beyond there." "Dirk Peters," I asked, "have you any idea of the route which you and Arthur Pym followed in the boat after your departure from Tsalal Island?" "None, sir. Poor Pym had no longer any instrument, you know, sea machines, for looking at the sun. We could not know except that for 8 days the current pushed us towards the south, and the wind also. A fine breeze and a fair sea, and our shirts for a sail." "Yes, white linen shirts which frightened your prisoner Nu Nu." "Perhaps so. I did not notice. But if Pym had said so, Pym must be believed." "And during those 8 days you were able to supply yourselves with food?" "Yes, sir, and the days after we and the savage, you know, the 3 turtles that were in the boat. These animals contain a store of fresh water, and their flesh is sweet, even raw. Oh, raw flesh, sir." He lowered his voice and threw a furtive glance around him. It would be impossible to describe the frightful expression of the half breed's face as he thus recalled the terrible scenes of the Grampus. And it was not the expression of a cannibal of Australia or the New Hebrides, but that of a man who is pervaded by an insurmountable horror of himself. "Was it not on the 1st of March, Dirk Peters," I asked, "that you perceived for the first time the veil of grey vapour shot with luminous and moving rays?" "I do not remember, sir, but if Pym says it was so, Pym must be believed." "Did he never speak to you of fiery rays which fell from the sky?" I did not use the term polar aurora, lest the half breed should not understand it. "Never, sir," said Dirk Peters after some reflection. "Did you not remark that the colour of the sea changed, grew white like milk, and that its surface became ruffled around your boat?" "It may have been so, sir. I did not observe. The boat went on, and my head went with it." "And then the fine powder, as fine as ashes, that fell?" "I don't remember it." "Was it snow?" "Snow? Yes. No. The weather was warm. What did Pym say? Pym must be believed." He lowered his voice and continued, "But Pym will tell you all that, sir. He knows. I do not know. He saw, and you will believe him." "Yes, Dirk Peters, I shall believe him." "We are to go in search of him, are we not?" "I hope so." "After we have found William Guy and the sailors of the Jane?" "Yes, after." "And even if we do not find them?" "Yes, even in that case. I think I shall induce our captain. I think he will not refuse." "No, he will not refuse to bring help to a man like him." "And yet," I said, "if William Guy and his people are living, we can admit that Arthur Pym—" "Living? Yes, living!" cried the half breed. "By the Great Spirit of my fathers, he is waiting for me, my poor Pym! How joyful he will be when he clasps his old Dirk in his arms, and when I feel him there. And the huge chest of the man heaved like a stormy sea. Then he went away, leaving me inexpressibly affected by the revelation of the tenderness for his unfortunate companion that lay deep in the heart of this semi savage. In the meantime I said but little to Captain Len Guy, whose whole heart and soul were set on the rescue of brother, of the possibility of our finding Arthur Gordon Pym. Time enough, if in the course of this strange enterprise of ours we succeeded in that object, to urge upon him one still more visionary. At length, on the 7th of January, according to Dirk Peters, who had fixed it only by the time that had expired. We arrived at the place where Nu Nu the savage breathed his last, lying in the bottom of the boat. On that day an observation gave 86° 33' for the latitude, the longitude remaining the same between the 42nd and the 43rd meridian. Here it was, according to the half breed, that the two fugitives were parted after the collision between the boat and the floating mass of ice. But a question now arose, since the mass of ice carrying away Dirk Peters had drifted towards the north. Was this because it was subjected to the action of a counter current? Yes, that must have been so, for our schooner had not felt the influence of the current which had guided her on leaving the Falklands for fully 4 days. And yet there is nothing surprising in that, for everything is variable in the austral seas. Happily the fresh breeze from the northeast continued to blow, and the Halbrane made progress towards higher water, 13 degrees in advance upon Weddell's ship, and 2 degrees upon the Jane. As for the land, islands, or continent, which Captain Len Guy was seeking on the surface of that vast ocean, it did not appear. I was well aware that he was gradually losing confidence in our enterprise. As for me, I was possessed by the desire to rescue Arthur Pym as well as the survivors of the Jane. And yet, how could he have survived? But then, the half-breed's fixed idea! Supposing our captain were to give the order to go back, what would Dirk Peters do? Throw himself into the sea rather than return northwards? This it was which made me dread some act of violence on his part, when he heard the greater number of the sailors protesting against this insensate voyage, and talking of putting the ship about, especially towards Hearne, who was stealthily inciting his comrades of the Falklands to insubordination. It was absolutely necessary not to allow discipline to decline, or discouragement to grow among the crew, so that, on the 7th of January, Captain Len Guy, at my request, assembled the men and addressed them in the following words: "Sailors of the Halbrane, since our departure from Tsalal Island, the schooner has gained 2 degrees southwards, and I now inform you that, conformably with the engagement signed by Mr. Joerling, $4,000, that is $2,000 for each degree, are due to you and will be paid at the end of the voyage." These words were greeted with some murmurs of satisfaction, but not with cheers, except those of Hurliguerly the boatswain and Endicott the cook, which found no echo. On the 13th of January a conversation took place between the boatswain and myself of a nature to justify my anxiety concerning the temper of our crew. The men were at breakfast, with the exception of Drap and Stern. The schooner was cutting the water under a stiff breeze. I was walking between the fore and main masts, watching the great flights of birds wheeling about the ship with deafening clangour, and the petrels occasionally perching on our yards. No effort was made to catch or shoot them. It would have been useless cruelty, since their oily and stringy flesh is not eatable. At this moment Hurliguerly approached me, looked attentively at the birds, and said, "I remark one thing, Mr. Jeorling." "What is it, boatswain?" "That these birds do not fly so directly south as they did up to the present. Some of them are setting north." "I have noticed the same fact." "And I add, Mr. Jeorling, that those who are below there will come back without delay." "And you conclude from this?" "I conclude that they feel the approach of winter." "Of winter?" "Undoubtedly." "No, no, boatswain, the temperature is so high that the birds can't want to get to less cold regions so prematurely." "Oh, prematurely, Mr. Jeorling?" "Yes, boatswain. Do we not know that navigators have always been able to frequent the Antarctic waters until the month of March?" "Not at such a latitude. Besides, there are precocious winters as well as precocious summers. The fine season this year
was full 2 months in advance, and it is to be feared the bad season may come sooner than usual."
"That is very likely," I replied. "After all, it does not apply to us, since our campaign will be certainly over in 3 weeks."
"If some obstacle does not arrive beforehand, Mr. Jeorling."
"And what obstacle?"
"For instance, a continent stretching to the south and barring our way." "A continent, Hurliguerly?" "I should not at all be surprised."
"And in fact there would be nothing surprising in it."
"As for the lands seen by Dirk Peters," said the boatswain, "where the men of the Jane might have landed on one or another of them, I don't believe in them."
"Why?"
"Because William Guy, who can only have had a small craft at his disposal, could not have got so far into these seas."
"I do not feel quite so sure of that."
"Nevertheless, Mr. Jeorling."
"What would be so surprising in William Guy's being carried to land somewhere by the action of currents? He did not remain on board his boat for 8 months, I suppose. His companions and he may have been able to land on an island, or even on a continent, and that is a sufficient motive for us to pursue our search."
"No doubt, but all are not of your opinion," replied Hurliguerly, shaking his head.
"I know," said I, "and that is what makes me most anxious. Is the ill feeling increasing?"
"I fear so, Mr. Jeorling. The satisfaction of having gained several hundreds of dollars is already lessened,
And the prospect of gaining a few more hundreds does not put a stop to disputes. And yet the prize is tempting. From Tsalal Island to the Pole, admitting that we might get there, is 6 degrees. Now 6 degrees at $2,000 each makes $12,000 for 30 men. That is $400 a head. A nice little sum to slip into one's pocket on the return of the Halbrane. But notwithstanding, that fellow Hearne works so wickedly upon his comrades that I believe they are ready to bout ship in spite of anybody." "I can believe that of the recruits, boatswain, but the old crew?"
"Hum! There are 3 or 4 of those who are beginning to reflect, and they are not easy in their minds about the prolongation of the voyage."
"I fancy Captain Len Guy and his lieutenant will know how to get themselves obeyed."
"We shall see, Mr. Jeorling. But may it not that our captain himself will get disheartened, that the sense of his responsibility will prevail, and that he will renounce his enterprise?"
"Yes, this is what I feared, and there was no remedy on that side."
"As for my friend Endicott, Mr. Jeorling, I answer for him as for myself. We would go to the end of the world, if the world has an end. Did the captain want to go there? True. We two, Dirk Peters and yourself, are but a few to be a law to the others."
"And what do you think of the half breed?" I asked.
"Well, our men appear to accuse him chiefly of the prolongation of the voyage. You see, Mr. Jeorling, though you have a good deal to do with it, you pay, and pay well, while this crazy fellow Dirk Peters persists in asserting that his poor Pym is still living. His poor Pym, who was drowned, or frozen, or crushed, killed anyhow, one way or another, 11 years ago."
So completely was this my own belief that I never discussed the subject with the half breed.
"You see, Mr. Jeorling," resumed the boatswain, "at the first some curiosity was felt about Dirk Peters. Then, after he saved Martin Holt, it was interest. Certainly he was no more talkative than before, and the bear came no oftener out of his den. But now we know what he is, and no one likes him the better for that. At all events, it was he
An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 18, Part-02. A Revelation. Nothing important occurred on the 13th and 14th, but a fresh fall in the temperature took place. Captain Len Guy called my attention to this, pointing out the flocks of birds continuously flying north. While he was speaking to me, I felt that his last hopes were fading, and who could wonder? Of the land indicated by the half-breed nothing was seen, and we were already more than 180 miles past Tsalal Island. At every point of the compass was the sea, nothing but the vast sea with its desert horizon, which the sun's disk had been nearing since the 21st, and would touch on the 21st March, prior to during the 6 months of the austral night. Honestly, was it possible to admit that William Guy and his 5 companions could have accomplished such a distance on a craft, and was there one chance in 100 that they could ever be recovered? On the 15th of January an observation most carefully taken gave 43° 13' longitude and 88° 17' latitude. The Halbrane was less than 2 degrees from the pole. Captain Len Guy did not seek to conceal the result of this observation, and the sailors knew enough of nautical calculation to understand it. Besides, if the consequences had to be explained to them, were not Holt and Hardy there to do this, and Hearne to exaggerate them to the utmost? During the afternoon I had indubitable proof that the sealing master had been working on the minds of the crew. The men, emerging at the foot of the mainmast, talked in whispers and cast evil glances at us. 2 or 3 sailors made threatening gestures undisguisedly. Then arose such angry mutterings that West could not be deaf to them. He strode forward and called out, "Silence there! The first man who speaks will have to reckon with me." Captain Len Guy was shut up in his cabin, but every moment I expected to see him come out, give one last long look around the wastes of waters, and then order the ship's course to be reversed. Nevertheless, on the next day the schooner was sailing in the same direction. Unfortunately for the circumstances had come some gravity. A mist was beginning to come down on us. I could not keep still. My apprehensions were redoubled. It was that West was only awaiting the order to change the helm. What mortal anguish the captain's must be! I understood too well that he would not give that order without hesitation. For several days past I had not seen the half-breed, or at least I had not exchanged a word with him. He was boycotted by the whole crew, with the exception of the boatswain, who was careful to address him, although rarely got a word in return. Dirk Peters took not the faintest notice of this state of things. He remained completely absorbed in his own thoughts. Yet had he heard West give the word to steer north, I know not what acts of violence he might have been driven to. He seemed to avoid me. Was this from a desire not to compromise me? On the 17th, in the afternoon, however, Dirk Peters manifested an intention of speaking to me, and never could I have imagined what I was to learn in that interview. It was about 2:30, and, not feeling well, I had gone to my cabin, where the side window was open, that at the back was closed. I heard a knock at the door, and asked who was there. "Dirk Peters," was the reply. "You want to speak to me?" "Yes." "I'm coming out." "If you please. I should prefer may I come into your cabin?" "Come in." He entered and shut the door behind him. Without rising I signed to him to seat himself in an arm chair, but he remained standing. "What do you want of me, Dirk Peters?" I asked at length, as he seemed unable to make up his mind to speak. "I want to tell you something, because it seems that you should know it, and you only. In the crew they must never know it." "If it is a grave matter, and you fear any indiscretion, Dirk Peters, why do you speak to me?" "If I must Ah, yes, I must. It is impossible to keep it there. It weighs on me like a stone." And Dirk Peters struck his breast violently. Then he resumed: "Yes, I am always afraid it may escape me during my sleep, and that some one will hear it, for I dream of it, and in dreaming—" "You dream," I replied, "and of what?" "Of him, of him. Therefore it is that I sleep in corners, all alone, for fear that his true name should be discovered." Then it struck me that the half breed was perhaps about to respond to an inquiry which I had not yet made, why he had gone to live at the Falklands under the name of Hunt after leaving Illinois. I put the question to him, and he replied: "It is not that. No, it is not that I wish." "I insist, Dirk Peters, and I desire to know in the first place for what reason did you not remain in America? For what reason you chose the Falklands?" "For what reason, sir? Because I wanted to get near Pym, my poor Pym. Because I hoped to find an opportunity at the Falklands of embarking on a whaling ship bound for the Southern Sea." "But that name of Hunt?" "I would not bear my own name any longer, on account of the affair of the Grampus." The half breed was alluding to the scene of the short straw, or lot drawing, on board the American brig, when it was decided between Augustus Barnard, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Parker the sailor, that one of the four should be sacrificed as food for the three others. I remembered the obstinate resistance of Arthur Pym, and how it was impossible for him to refuse to take the tragedy about to be performed. He says this himself, and the horrible act, whose remembrance must poison the existence of all those who had survived it. Oh, that lot drawing! The short straws were little splinters of wood of uneven length which Arthur held in his hand. The shortest was to designate him who should be immolated, and he speaks of the sort of involuntary, fierce desire to deceive his corn that he felt. To cheat is the word he uses. But he did not cheat, and he asked pardon for having had the idea. Let us try to put ourselves in his place. He made up his mind and held out his hand, closed on the four slips. Dirk Peters drew the first. Fate favoured him. He had nothing more to fear. Arthur Pym calculated the one more chance was against him. Augustus Barnard drew in turn. Save two he. And now Arthur Pym reckoned up the exact chances Parker and himself. At that moment all the ferocity the tiger entered into his soul. He conceived an intense and devilish hatred of his poor comrade, his fellow man. 5 minutes elapsed before Parker dared to draw. At length Arthur Pym, standing with eyes closed, not knowing whether the lot was for or against him, felt a hand seize his own. It was the hand of Dirk Peters. Arthur Pym had escaped death. And then the half breed came upon Parker and stabbed him in the back. The frightful repast followed immediately, and words are not sufficient to convey to the mind the horror of the reality. Yes, I knew that hideous story, not a fable, as I had long believed. This was what had happened on board the Grampus on the 16th of July, 1827, and vainly did I try to understand Dirk Peters' reason for recalling it to my recollection. "Well, Dirk Peters," I said, "I will ask you, since you were anxious to hide your name, what it was that induced you to reveal it when the Halbrane was moored off Tsalal Island. Why did you not keep to the name of Hunt?" "Sir, understand me. There was hesitation about going further. They wanted to turn back. This was decided, and then I thought that by telling you who I was, Dirk Peters, of the Grampus, my poor Pym's companion, I should be heard. They would believe with me that he was still living. They would go in search of him. And yet it was a serious thing to do, to acknowledge that I was Dirk Peters, he who had killed Parker. But hunger, devouring hunger—" "Come, come, Dirk Peters," said I, "you exaggerate. If the lot had fallen to you, you would have incurred the fate of Parker. You cannot be charged with a crime." "Sir, would Parker's family speak of it as you do?" "His family? Had he, then, relations?" "Yes, and that is why Pym changed his name in the narrative. Parker's name was not Parker, it was—" "Arthur Pym was right," I said, interrupting him quickly. "And as for me, I do not wish to know Parker's real name. Keep this secret." "No, I will tell it to you. It weighs too heavily on me, and I shall be relieved, perhaps, when I have told you, Mr. Jeorling." "No, Dirk Peters, no." "His name was Holt, Ned Holt." "Holt!" I exclaimed. "The same name as our sailing master's?" "Who is his own brother, sir." "Martin Holt?" "Yes. Understand me. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 19, Part 1. Land. Land is the only word to be found at the beginning of the 19th chapter of Edgar Poe's book. I thought it would be a good idea, placing after it a note of interrogation, to put it as a heading to this portion of our narrative. Did that word, dropped from our foremast head, indicate an island or a continent? And, whether a continent or an island, did not a disappointment await us? Could they be there whom we had come to seek? And Arthur Pym, who was dead, unquestionably dead in spite of Dirk Peters' assertions, had he ever set foot on this land? When the welcome word resounded on board the Jane on the 17th January 1828, a day full of incidents according to Arthur Pym's diary, it was succeeded by "Land on the starboard bow." Such might have been the signal from the masthead of the Halbrane. The outline of land, lightly drawn above the sky line, were visible on this side. The land announced to the sailors of the Jane was the wild and barren Bennet Islet. Less than 1 degree south of it lay Tsalal Island, then fertile, habitable, and inhabited, and on which Captain Len Guy had hoped to meet his fellow countrymen. But what would this unknown island, 5 degrees further off in the depths of the Southern Sea, be for our schooner? Was it the goal so ardently desired, and so earnestly sought for? Were the two brothers, William and Len Guy, to meet at this place? Would the Halbrane come there to the end of a voyage whose success would be definitely secured by the restoration of the survivors of the Jane to their country? I repeat that I was just like the half breed. Our aim was not merely to discover the survivors, nor was success in this matter the only success we looked for. However, since land was before our eyes, we must get nearer to it first. That cry of land caused an immediate diversion of our thoughts. I no longer dwelt upon the secret Dirk Peters had just told me, and perhaps the half breed forgot it also, for he rushed to the bow and fixed his eyes immovably on the horizon. As for West, whom nothing could divert from his duty, he repeated his commands. Gratian came to take the helm, and Hearne was shut up in the hold. On the whole this was a just punishment, and none of the old crew protested against it, for Hearne's inattention awkwardness had really endangered the schooner for a short time only. 5 or 6 of the Falkland sailors did, however, murmur a little. A sign from the mate silenced them, and they returned at once to their posts. Needless to say, Captain Len Guy, upon hearing the cry of the look-out man, had tumbled up from his cabin, and eagerly examined this land at 10 or 12 miles distance. As I have said, I was no longer thinking about the secret Dirk Peters had confided to me. Besides, so long as the secret remained between us two, and neither would betray it, there was nothing to fear. But if ever an unlucky accident were to reveal to Martin Holt that his brother's name had been changed to Parker, that the unfortunate man had not perished in the shipwreck of the Grampus, but had been sacrificed to save his companions from perishing hunger, that Dirk Peters, to whom Martin Holt himself owed his life, had killed him with his own hand, what might not happen then? This was the reason why the half-breed shrank from any expression of thanks from Martin Holt, why he avoided Martin Holt, the victim's brother. The boatswain had just struck 6 bells. The schooner was sailing with the caution demanded by navigation in unknown seas. There might be shoals or reefs barely hidden under the surface, on which she might run aground or be wrecked. As things stood with the Halbrane, and even admitting that she could be floated again, an accident would have rendered her return impossible before the winter set in. We had urgent need that every chance should be in our favour, and not one against us. West had given orders to shorten sail. When the boatswain had furled the top gallant sail, the topsail, and the royal, the Halbrane remained under her mainsail, her foresail, and her jib, sufficient canvas to cover the distance that separated her from land in a few hours. Captain Len Guy immediately heaved the lead, which showed a depth of 20 fathoms. Several other soundings showed that the coast, which was very steep, was probably prolonged like a wall under the water. Nevertheless, as the bottom might happen to rise sharply instead of following the slope of the coast, we did not venture to proceed out of the sounding line in hand. The weather was still beautiful, although the sky was overcast by a mist from the southeast to southwest. Owing to this, there was some difficulty in identifying the vague outlines which stood out like a floating vapour in the sky, disappearing and then reappearing between the breaks of the mist. However, we all agreed to regard this land as from 25 to 30 fathoms in height, at least at its highest part. No, we would not admit that we were the victims of a delusion, and yet our uneasy minds feared that it might be so. Is it not natural, after all, for the heart to be assailed by 1,000 apprehensions as we near the end of any enterprise? At this thought my mind became confused and dreamy. The Halbrane seemed to be reduced to the dimensions of a small boat lost in this boundless space, the contrary of that limitless sea of which Edgar Poe speaks, where, like a living body, the ship grows larger. When we have charts or even sailing directions instruct us concerning the hydrography of the coasts, the nature of the landfalls, the bays and the creeks, we may sail along boldly. In every other region, the master of the ship must not defer the order to cast anchor near the shore until the morrow. But where we were, what an amount of prudence was necessary! And yet no manifest obstacle was before us. Moreover, we had no cause to fear that the light would fail us during the sunny night. At this season the sun did not set so soon under the western horizon, and its rays bathed the vast Antarctic zone in unabated light. From that day forward the ship's log recorded that the temperature fell continuously. The thermometer in the air and in the shade did not mark more than 32 degrees, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and when plunged into the water it only indicated 26 degrees, 3.33 degrees Celsius below zero. What could be the cause of this fall, since we were at the height of the southern summer? the crew were obliged to resume their woollen clothing, which they had left off a month previously. The schooner, however, was sailing before the wind, and these first cold blasts were less keenly felt. Yet we recognized the necessity of reaching our goal as soon as possible. To linger in this region, or to expose ourselves to the danger of wintering out, would be to tempt Providence. Captain Len Guy tested the direction of the currents by heavy lead lines, and discovered that it was beginning to deviate from its former course.
"Whether it is a continent," he said, "that lies before us, or whether it is an island, we have at present no means of determining. If it be a continent, we must conclude that the current has an issue towards the southeast."
"And it is quite possible," I replied, "that the solid part of the Antarctic region may be reduced to a mere polar mound. In any case, it is well to note any of those observations which are likely to be accurate."
"That is what I am doing, Mr. Jeorling, and we shall bring back a mass of information about this portion of the Southern Sea which will prove useful to navigators."
"If ever any venture to come so far south, captain. We have penetrated so far, thanks to the help of particular circumstances, the earliness of the summer season, an abnormal temperature, and a rapid thaw. Such conditions may only occur once in 20 or 50 years.
Wherefore, Mr. Jeorling, I thank Providence for this, and hope revives in me to some extent. As the weather has been constantly fine, what is there to make it impossible for my brother and my fellow countrymen to have landed on this coast, whither the wind and the tide bore them? What our schooner has done, their boat may have done. They surely did not start on a voyage which might be prolonged to an indefinite time without a proper supply of provisions. Why should they not have found the resources as those afforded to them by the island of Tsalal during many long years? They had ammunition and arms elsewhere. Fish abound in these waters, waterfowl also. Oh yes, my heart is full of hope, and I wish I were a few hours older."
Without being quite so sanguine as Len Guy, I was glad to see he had regained his hopeful mood. Perhaps his investigations were successful. I might be able to have them continued in Arthur Pym's interest, even into the heart of this strange land which we were approaching. The Halbrane was going along slowly on these clear waters, which swarmed with fish belonging to the same species as we had already met. The sea birds were more numerous, and were evidently not frightened, for they kept flying round the mast, or perching in the yards. Several whitish ropes, about 5 or 6 feet long, were brought on board. They were chaplets formed of millions of shellfish. Whales, spouting jets of feathery water from their blow holes, appeared at a distance, and I remarked that all of them took a southerly direction. There was therefore reason to believe that the sea extended far and wide in that direction. The schooner covered 2 or 3 miles of her course without any increase of speed. This coast evidently stretched from north-west to south-east. Nevertheless, the telescopes revealed no distinctive features, even after 3 hours' navigation. The crew, gathered together on the forecastle, were looking on without revealing their impressions. West, after going aloft to the fore-cross trees, where he had remained 10 minutes, had reported nothing precise. Stationed at the port side, leaning my elbows on the bulwarks, I closely watched the skyline, broken only towards the east. At this moment the boatswain rejoined me, and without preface said, "Will you allow me to give you my opinion, Mr. Jeorling?" "Give it, boatswain," I replied, "at the risk of my not adopting it, if I don't agree with it."
"It is correct, and according as we get nearer, one must really be blind not to adopt it."
"And what idea have you got?"
"That this is not land which lies before us, Mr. Jeorling."
"What is it you are saying?"
"Look attentively, putting one finger before your eyes. Look there, out at starboard."
I did as Hurliguerly directed.
"Do you see?" he began again. "May I lose my liking for my grog if these heights do not change place, not with regard to the schooner, but with regard to themselves."
"And what do you conclude from this?"
"That they are moving icebergs."
"Icebergs?"
"Sure enough, Mr. Jeorling."
Was not the boatswain mistaken? Were we in for a disappointment? Were there only drifting ice mountains in the distance instead of a shore? Presently there was no doubt on the subject. For some time past the crew had no longer believed the existence of land in that direction. 10 minutes afterwards the man in the crow's nest announced that several icebergs were coming north west, in an oblique direction, into the course of the Halbrane. This news produced great sensation on board. Our last hope was suddenly extinguished. And what a blow to Captain Len Guy! We should have to seek land of the austral zone under higher latitudes, without being sure of ever coming across it. And then the cry, "Back ship! Back ship!" sounded almost unanimously on board the Halbrane. Yes, indeed, the recruits from the Falklands demanding that we should turn back, although Hearne was not there to fan the flame of insubordination, and I must acknowledge that the greater part of the old tars seemed to agree with them. West awaited his chief's orders, not daring to impose silence. Gratian was at the helm, ready to give a turn to the wheel, whilst his comrades, with their hands on the cleats, were preparing to ease off the sheets. Dirk Peters remained immovable, leaning against the foremast, his head down, his body bent, and his mouth set firm. Not a word passed his lips. But now he turned towards me, and what a look of mingled wrath and entreaty he gave me! I don't know what irresistible motive induced me to interfere personally, and once again to protest. A final argument had just crossed my mind, an argument whose weight could not be disputed. So I began to speak, and I did so with such conviction that none tried to interrupt me. The substance of what I said was as follows: No, all hope must not be abandoned. Land cannot be far off. The icebergs which formed in the open sea by the accumulation of ice are not before us. These icebergs must have broken off from the solid base of a continent or an island. Now, since the thaw begins at this season of the year, the drift will only last a short time. Behind them we must meet the coast on which they were formed. In another 24 hours, or 48 at the most, if the land does not appear, Captain Len Guy will steer to the north again. Had I convinced the crew, or ought I to take advantage of Hearne's absence, and of the fact that he could not communicate with them, to make them understand that they were being deceived, and to repeat to them that it would endanger the schooner if our course were now to be reversed? The boatswain came to my help, and in a good humoured voice exclaimed, "Very well reasoned, and for my part I accept Mr. Jeorling's opinion. Assuredly land is near. If we seek it beyond those icebergs, we shall discover it without much hard work or great danger. What is 1 degree further south, when it is a question of putting $100 additional into one's pocket? And let us not forget that if they are acceptable when they go in, they are none the less so when they come out." An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 19, Part-02. Land. During the next 24 hours the Halbrane took a south-southwesterly course. Nevertheless, her direction must have been frequently changed and her speed decreased in avoiding the ice. The navigation became very difficult so soon as the schooner headed towards the line of the bergs, which it had to cut obliquely. However, there were none of the packs which blocked up all access to the icebergs on the 67th parallel. The enormous heaps were melting away with majestic slowness. The ice blocks appeared quite new, to employ a perfectly accurate expression, and perhaps they had only been formed some days. However, with a height of 150 feet, their bulk must have been calculated by millions of tons. West was watching closely in order to avoid collisions, and did not leave the deck even for an instant. Until now Captain Len Guy had always been able to rely upon the indications of the compass. The magnetic pole, still hundreds of miles off, had no influence on the compass, its direction being east. The needle remained steady and might be trusted. So, in spite of my conviction, founded, however, on very serious arguments, there was no sign of land, and I was wondering whether it would not be better to steer more to the west, at the risk of removing the Halbrane from that extreme point where the meridians of the globe cross each other. Thus the hours went by, and I was only allowed 48. It was only too plain that lack of courage prevailed, and that everyone was inclined to be insubordinate. Another day and a half. I could no longer contend with the general discontent. The schooner must ultimately retrace her course towards the north. The crew were working in silence, while West was giving sharp orders for manoeuvring through the channels, sometimes luffing in order to avoid a collision, now bearing away almost square before the wind. Nevertheless, in spite of a close watch, in spite of the skill of the sailors, in spite of the prompt execution of the manoeuvres, dangerous friction against the hull, which left long traces of the ridge of the iceberg, occurred. And in truth the bravest could not repress a feeling of terror when thinking that the planking might have given way, and the sea have invaded us. The base of these floating ice mountains was very steep, so that it would have been impossible for us to land upon one. Moreover, we saw no seals, these usually very numerous where the ice fields abounded, nor even a flock of the screeching penguins, which, on other occasions, the Halbrane sent diving by myriads as she passed through them. The birds themselves seemed rarer and wilder. Dread, from which none of us could escape, seemed to come upon us from these desolate and deserted regions. How could we still entertain a hope that the survivors of the Jane had found shelter, and obtained means of existence in those awful solitudes? And if the Halbrane were also shipwrecked, would there remain any evidence of her fate? Since the previous day, from the moment our southern course had been abandoned to cut the line of the icebergs, a change had taken place in the demeanour of the half-breed. Nearly always crouched down at the foot of the foremast, looking afar into the boundless space, he only got up in order to lend a hand to some manoeuvre, and without any of his former vigilance or zeal. Not that he had ceased to believe that his comrade of the Jane was still living. That thought never even came into his mind. But he felt by instinct that the traces of poor Pym were not to be recovered by following this course. "Sir," he would have said to me, "this is not the way. No, this is not the way." And how could I have answered him? Towards 7 o'clock in the evening a rather thick mist arose. This would tend to make the navigation of the schooner difficult and dangerous. The day, with its emotions of anxiety and alternatives, had worn me out. So I returned to my cabin, where I threw myself on my bunk in my clothes. But sleep did not come to me, owing to my besetting thoughts. I willingly admit that the constant reading of Edgar Poe's works, and reading them in this place, in which his heroes delighted, had exercised an influence on me which I did not fully recognize. To morrow the 48 hours would be up, the last concession which the crew had made to my entreaties. "Things are not going as you wish?" the boatswain said to me just as I was leaving the deck. No, certainly not, since land was not to be seen behind the fleet of icebergs. If no sign of a coast appeared between these moving masses, Captain Len Guy would steer north to morrow. Ah, were I only master of the schooner! If I could have bought it even at the price of all my fortune! If these men had been my slaves to drive by the lash, the Halbrane should never have given up this voyage, even if it led her so far as the point above which flames the Southern Cross. My mind was quite upset, and teemed with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 regrets, 1,000 desires. I wanted to get up, but a heavy hand held me down in my bunk, and I longed to leave this cabin where I was struggling against nightmare in my half sleep, to launch one of the boats of the Halbrane, to jump into it with Dirk Peters, who would not hesitate about following me, and so abandon both of us to the current running south. And lo, I was doing this in a dream. It is to morrow. Captain Len Guy has given orders to reverse our course, after a last glance at the horizon. One of the boats is in tow. I warn the half breed. We creep along without being seen. We cut the painter. Whilst the schooner sails on ahead, we stay astern, and the current carries us off. Thus we should drift on the sea without hindrance. At length our boat stops. Land is there. I see a sort of Sphinx surmounting the southern peak. The sea Sphinx. I go to him. I question him. He discloses the secrets of these mysterious regions to me. And then the phenomena, whose reality Arthur Pym asserted appear around the mystic monster. The certain flickering of vapours, striped with luminous rays, is rent asunder. And it is not a face of superhuman grandeur which arises before my astonished eyes. It is Arthur Pym, fierce guardian of the South Pole, flaunting the ensign of the United States in those high latitudes. Was this dream suddenly interrupted, or was it changed by a freak of my brain? I cannot tell, but I felt as though I had been suddenly awakened. It seemed as though a change had taken place in the motion of the schooner, which was sliding along the surface of the quiet sea, with a slight list to starboard, and yet there was neither rolling nor pitching. Yes, I felt myself carried off as though my bunk were the car of an air balloon. I was not mistaken, and I had fallen from dreamland into reality. Crash succeeded crash overhead. I could not account for them. Inside my cabin the partitions deviated from the vertical in such a way as to make one believe that the Halbrane had fallen over on her beam ends. Almost immediately I was thrown out of my bunk, and barely escaped splitting my skull against the corner of the table. However, I got up again, and, clinging to the edge of the door frame, I propped myself against the door. At this instant the bulwarks began to crack, and the port side of the ship was torn open. Could there have been a collision between the schooner and one of those gigantic floating masses which West was unable to avoid in the mist? Suddenly loud shouts came from the after deck, and then screams of terror, in which the maddened voices of the crew joined. At length there came a final crash, and the Halbrane remained motionless. I had to crawl along the floor to reach the door and gain the deck. Captain Len Guy, having already left his cabin, dragged himself on his knees, so great was the list to port, and caught on as best he could. In the forepart of the ship, between the forecastle and the foremast, many heads appeared. Dirk Peters, Hardy, Martin Holt, and Endicott, the latter with his black face quite vacant, were clinging to the starboard shrouds. A man came creeping up to me, because the slope of the deck prevented him from holding himself upright. It was Hurliguerly, working himself along with his hands like a topman on a yard. Stretched out at full length, my feet propped up against the jamb of the door, I held out my hand to the boatswain and helped him, not without difficulty, to hoist himself up near me. "What is wrong?" I asked. "A stranding, Mr. Jeorling." "We are ashore?" "Ashore presupposes land," replied the boatswain ironically, "and so far as land goes, there was never any except in that rascal Dirk Peters' imagination." "But tell me what has happened." "We came upon an iceberg in the middle of the fog, and were unable to keep clear of it." "An iceberg, boatswain?" "Yes, an iceberg, which has chosen just now to turn head over heels. In turning, it struck the Halbrane and carried it off just as a battledore catches a shuttlecock. And now here we are, stranded at certainly 100 feet above the level of the Antarctic Sea." Could one have imagined a more terrible conclusion to the adventurous voyage of the Halbrane? In the middle of these remote regions, our only means of transport had just been snatched from its natural element, and carried off by the turn of an iceberg to a height of more than 100 feet. What a conclusion! To be swallowed up in a polar tempest, to be destroyed in a fight with savages, to be crushed in the ice, such are the dangers to which any ship engaged in the polar seas is exposed. But to think that the Halbrane had been lifted by a floating mountain, just as that mountain was turning over, was stranded, and almost at its summit! No, such a thing seemed quite impossible. I did not know whether we could succeed in letting down the schooner from this height with the means we had at our disposal. But I did know that Captain Len Guy, the mate, and the older members of the crew, when they had recovered from their first fright, would not give up in despair, no matter how terrible the situation might be. Of that I had no doubt whatsoever. They would all look to the general safety. As for the measures to be taken, no one yet knew anything. A foggy veil, a sort of greyish mist, still hung over the iceberg. Nothing could be seen of its enormous mass, except the narrow craggy cleft in which the schooner was wedged, nor even what place it occupied in the middle of the ice fleet drifting towards the southeast. Common prudence demanded that we should quit the Halbrane, which might slide down at a sharp shake of the iceberg. Were we even certain that the latter had regained its position on the surface of the sea? Was her stability secure? Should we not be on the lookout for a fresh upheaval? And if the schooner were to fall into the abyss, which of us could extricate himself safe and sound from such a fall, and then from the final plunge into the depths of the ocean? In a few minutes the crew had abandoned the Halbrane. Each man sought for refuge on the ice slopes, awaiting the time when the iceberg should be freed from mist. The oblique rays from the sun did not succeed in piercing it, and the red disc could hardly be perceived through the opaque mass. However, we could not distinguish each other at about 12 feet apart. As for the Halbrane, she looked like a confused blackish mass, standing out sharply against the whiteness of the ice. We had now to ascertain whether any of those who were on the deck at the time of the catastrophe had been thrown over the bulwarks and precipitated into the sea. By Captain Len Guy's orders, all the sailors then present joined the group in which I stood with the mate, the boatswain, Hardy, and Martin Holt. So far, this catastrophe had cost us 5 men. These were the first since our departure from Kerguelen, but were they to be the last? There was no doubt that these unfortunate fellows had perished, because we called to them in vain, and in vain we sought for them. When the fog abated along the sides of the iceberg, at every place where they might have been able to catch on to a projection, When the disappearance of the 5 men had been ascertained, we fell into despair. Then we felt more keenly than before the dangers which threatened every expedition to the Antarctic zone. "What about Hearne?" said a voice. Martin Holt pronounced the name at a moment when there was general silence. Had the sailing master been crushed to death in the narrow part of the hold where he was shut up? West rushed towards the schooner, hoisted himself on board by the means of a rope hanging over the bows, and gained the hatch which gives access to that part of the hold. We waited, silent and motionless, to learn of the fate of Hearne, although the evil spirit of the crew was but little worthy of our pity. And yet, how many of us were then thinking that if we had heeded his advice, and if the schooner had taken the northern course, a whole crew would not have been reduced to take refuge on a drifting ice mountain. I scarcely dared to calculate my own share of the vast responsibility, I who had so vehemently insisted on the prolongation of the voyage. At length the mate reappeared on deck, and Hearne followed him. By miracle, neither the bulkheads nor the ribs nor the planking had yielded at the place where the sealing master was confined. Hearne rejoined his comrades without opening his lips, and we had no further trouble about him. Towards 6 o'clock in the morning the fog cleared off, owing to a marked fall in the temperature. We had no longer to do with completely frozen vapour, but had to deal with the phenomenon called frost rime, which often occurs in these high latitudes. Captain Len Guy recognized it by the quantity of prismatic threads, the point following the wind, which roughened the light ice crust deposited on the sides of the iceberg. Navigators know better than to confound this frost rime with the hoar frost of the temperate zones, which only freezes when it has been deposited on the surface of the soil. We were now enabled to estimate the size of the solid mass on which we were clustered like flies on a sugar loaf, and the schooner, seen from below, looked no bigger than the yawl of a trading vessel. The iceberg, of between 300 and 400 fathoms in circumference, measured from 130 to 140 feet high. According to all calculations, therefore, its depth would be 4 or 5 times greater, and it would consequently weigh millions of tons. This is what had happened. The iceberg, having been melted away at its base by contact with warmer waters, had risen little by little. Its centre of gravity had become displaced, and its equilibrium could only be re-established by a sudden capsize, which had lifted up the part that had been underneath above the sea level. The Halbrane, caught in this movement, was hoisted as by an enormous lever. Numbers of icebergs capsize thus on the polar seas, and form one of the greatest dangers to which approaching vessels are exposed. Our schooner was caught in a hollow on the west side of the iceberg. She listed to starboard, with her stern raised and her bow lowered. We could not help thinking that the slightest shake would cause her to slide along the slope of the iceberg into the sea. The collision had been so violent as to stave in some of the planks of her hull. After the first collision, the galley situated before the foremast had broken its fastenings. The door between Captain Len Guy's and the mate's cabins was torn away from the hinges. The topmast and the topgallant mast had come down after the backstays parted, and fresh fractures could plainly be seen as high as the cap of the masthead. Fragments of all kinds, yards, spars, a part of the sails, breakers, cases, hen coops, were probably floating at the foot of the mass and drifting with it. The most alarming part of our situation was the fact that of the 2 boats belonging to the Halbrane, one had been stove in when we grounded, and the other, the larger of the 2, was still hanging on by its tackles to the starboard davits. Before anything else was done, this boat had to be put in a safe place, because it might prove our only means of escape. As a result of the first examination, we found that the lower masts had remained in their places, and might be of use if ever we succeeded in releasing the schooner. But how were we to release her from her bed in the ice, and restore her to her natural element? When I found myself with Captain Len Guy, the mate, and the boatswain, I questioned them on this subject. "I agree with you," replied West, "that the operation involves great risks, but since it is indispensable, we will accomplish it. I think it will be necessary to dig out a sort of slide down to the base of the iceberg." "And without the delay of a single day," added Captain Len Guy. "Do you hear, boatswain?" said Jem West. "Work begins to day." "I hear, and every one will set himself to the task," replied Hurliguerly. "If you allow me, I shall just make one observation, captain." "What is it?" "Before beginning the work, let us examine the hull, and see what the damage is, and whether it can be repaired. For what use would it be to launch a ship stripped of her planks, which would go to the bottom at once?" We complied with the boatswain's just demand. The fog having cleared off, a bright sun then illuminated the eastern side of the iceberg, whence the sea was visible round a large part of the horizon. Here the sides of the iceberg showed rugged projections, ledges, shoulders, and even flat instead of smooth surfaces, giving no foothold, however